On the 17th of April 2021, Windsor Castle held a funeral for 30 people. The guest list had started at 800 names. The pandemic restrictions collapsed it to 30. The palace made the cuts with the precision of people who had spent generations deciding who stood where and how close and what distance said about which relationships. The Queen sat alone in her pew, masked, in black, 11 feet of empty wooden bench on either side of her. That image, the masked widow on the long bench, became the single most published photograph of that entire year. The coffin held the man she had been married to for 73 years. Among the 30 permitted mourners stood a woman who was not immediate family. She was not a royal household official. She was not the widow of anyone who had died with a title formally connected to the palace structure. She was Penelope Knatchbull, the Countess Mountbatten of Burma, known to everyone who knew her as Penny. She had turned 68 years old the previous day. Her birthday fell on the 16th of April. The funeral was on the 17th. She came to Windsor on the morning after her birthday. The palace issued guidance to the press about her presence. They explained that her husband, Norton Natchbull, the Earl Mountbatten of Burma, was unwell and unable to attend. She was therefore there as his representative. Royal observers found this framing so inadequate that several said so in print without hesitation. One commentator described it as slightly demeaning to Penny, since she had been far closer to the Duke of Edinburgh than her husband had ever been. An aide told reporters she looked heartbroken when she arrived. The aide used the phrase, best friend. Palace staff had their own phrase for her, and had been using it for decades. They called her, and also. When Prince Philip compiled a guest list, any guest list, for any occasion at Windsor or Sandringham, or anywhere in the annual calendar of royal private life, he concluded the list the same way. The core names, the family, the officials, the household staff, and then one consistent addition, written at the bottom, in the manner of something that goes without saying, because it has always been the case, and also Penny. That funeral, with its 30 chairs and its careful institutional explanations, was the public ending of something that had been building for over 30 years, and the public acknowledgement, however oblique and however diplomatically framed, of a connection that the palace had never quite known how to name. What exactly that connection was, is one of the more honest and more complicated questions in the whole history of the Windsor family, which is not a family that has historically found honest and complicated questions to be its preferred mode of operation. This is the story of Philip's circle, not the official one, not the listed appointments and the household designations, and the equerry rotations that appear in the court circular, the other circle. The one that knew him at the Thursday Club in Soho in the 1950s, drinking port and ignoring the time. The one that watched him in theatre dressing rooms and at race meetings and aboard the royal yacht on the long solo voyages when the press could not easily follow. The circle that included a Greek cabaret singer whose children he paid school fees for and whose paternity question he neither confirmed nor addressed for the rest of his life. The circle that included a British stage actress whose career was damaged by one late dinner in 1948, a night she spent the next 59 years asking him to help her recover from, and that he spent 59 years declining to mention. The circle that included a Jungian psychologist with an Irish estate who told biographers the relationship had been passionate but clarified, without being asked, that the passion had been in the ideas. The circle that included Penny Natchbull herself, who appeared at his side for 30 years with a steadiness that made every formal description of their connection sound like a sentence with its main clause missing. None of these people were officially acknowledged in the way that royal companions are typically designated. None were given formal titles or household positions. None appeared in the court circular as personal companions. They were present in the places where Philip looked most like himself, in the social worlds and physical spaces where the institutional performance of the Duke of Edinburgh was not required. And they were present across the gaps that a marriage built inside a monarchy carves out of a man's private life and leaves him to fill by whatever means and with whoever he chooses. He was not a man who complained about any of this in public. He was not a man who gave the long, explanatory interviews that biographers prefer, in which the heart's arrangements are spelled out for the record. He was a man who acted. He appeared at dressing rooms and paid school fees and sat through decades of horse shows and invited people onto yachts and arranged guest lists and kept his counsel for 70 years. The meaning of those actions is what his circle spent their lives either protecting or occasionally, carefully, allowing to be glimpsed. The answer to the question that runs beneath the whole account, whether he was unfaithful to the Queen, is that nobody outside the people directly involved established it with certainty, and those people chose not to say. His private secretary, Mike Parker, insisted Philip had been 100% faithful to her. Lord Charteris, who served as the Queen's own private secretary for many years, and who therefore knew the interior life of the palace better than most people who were not inside the family, said there was no evidence of any kind that he had strayed. Pamela Hicks, who served as lady-in-waiting and bridesmaid to the Queen, and who knew both of them across decades, told biographer Sally Bedell Smith that the Queen was very aware that Philip liked to flirt, and that she did not mind. The Queen understood him very well, Hicks said. She recognized his friendships for what they were. They were based on some shared interest like carriage driving, or a fondness for the work of Carl Jung, and they were not affairs. She knew it was absolutely nothing. That testimony carries weight. Those three sources were close to the center. They were not speaking carelessly or for self-protection. They had the access and the longevity of knowledge to know what they were talking about. Parker had been with Philip daily for 10 years. Charteris had observed the marriage from the office immediately adjacent to the Queen's. Hicks had been present for the whole arc of it. And yet Pat Kirkwood spent 59 years waiting for Philip to clear her name and died on Christmas Day 2007 without receiving anything close to that clearance. Elén Cordet published a memoir about her own life without once answering the central question the memoir raised. Sacha Abercorn told a reporter that her relationship with Philip had been a passionate friendship, but then added, unprompted, that the passion had been in the ideas, that it had certainly not been a full relationship, and that she had not gone to bed with him. When a person volunteers that last clarification without being asked for it, they know precisely what people have been assuming. These are the two sides of the same account, and they have existed in tension since Philip first began accumulating the circle that watched him. Parker and Charteris and Hicks on one side, Kirkwood's waiting and Elén's silence, and Sacha's precision on the other. The two sides do not resolve into a simple answer, because the answer was never simple, and because simple answers about complicated people are almost always wrong. To understand the circle, you must understand the man at its center. To understand the man, you cannot begin with the naval uniform, or the Duke of Edinburgh's award, or the famous gaffes that the press collected with the enthusiasm of people who understood that his willingness to say what he thought was one of his most marketable qualities. You must begin earlier. You must begin on an island in the Mediterranean, in the summer of 1921, when the whole story began on a dining room table. If you are watching this channel for the first time, subscribe now and ring the notification bell. This channel covers the real history behind the British royal family, the version that stayed inside the household rather than reaching the public record. We cover it carefully and from the sources that were actually there. Stay with us. Prince Philip was born on the 10th of June 1921 in a small rented villa on the eastern shore of the Greek island of Corfu. The villa was called Mon Repos. The birth took place, according to the family account that passed down through his children and their biographers, on the dining room table, because the upstairs bedrooms were judged unsuitable for the delivery. The attending doctor was Greek. The midwife was Greek. The baby was registered on his birth certificate as a Prince of Greece and Denmark, the fifth child and only son of Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark and his wife, Princess Alice of Battenberg. He was christened Philippos, after no one in particular. He was the youngest by a margin of 7 years. His 4 elder sisters, Margarita, Theodora, Cecilia, and Sophie, ranged from 16 down to 7 at the time of his birth. They adored him. The summer of 1921, preserved in family photographs that survive that period, was one of the few stretches of his childhood that resembled anything approaching ordinary family life. It lasted roughly 18 months. Greece in 1922 was losing a catastrophic war with Turkey. The Greek army collapsed in September of that year. The new military government, searching for officers to hold responsible for the disaster, arrested Philip's father. Prince Andrew had commanded a division during the campaign. The government charged him with high treason. The general and 5 politicians tried in the same proceedings were taken out and shot. Prince Andrew's execution was the expected outcome. King George V of Great Britain moved. He sent the cruiser HMS Calypso to Phaleron Bay outside Athens, and the British naval attaché negotiated with the Greek military government. Prince Andrew was sentenced to perpetual banishment rather than death. He was taken aboard the Calypso with his wife and 5 children. Philip, 18 months old, was carried to the vessel in what family legend describes as a cot, improvised from an orange crate lined with cushions. The image is possibly apocryphal. The biographers who have examined it note it may be the kind of detail that attaches to a story because the story needs a symbol. What is not apocryphal is the exile. From that night in December 1922 until his death nearly a century later, Philip never lived in Greece again. The family settled first in Paris, in a small house in the suburb of Saint-Cloud, lent to them by Princess George of Greece, who was a Bonaparte by birth and had inherited a fortune that was not common to the family's general financial situation. They lived on her charity. Prince Andrew, who had been a soldier for his entire adult life and had no other profession and no country left to soldier for, sat in Paris cafes and drank and gambled and allowed his marriage to deteriorate, with the quiet resignation of a man who had decided that the situation was irredeemable. He was 42 when the exile began. He would never work again. By the early 1930s, he had established himself in Monaco with a French mistress named André Lafayette, who remained his companion until he died there in December 1944, nearly penniless. Princess Alice of Battenberg, Philip's mother, was the one who attempted to hold the family together through those Paris years. She had been born at Windsor Castle in 1885 in the presence of her great-grandmother, Queen Victoria. She was congenitally deaf, had learned to lip-read in 3 languages with a determination that impressed everyone who met her, and had a force of personality that her son would visibly inherit. She had converted to Greek Orthodoxy when she married Prince Andrew in 1903, and had followed him through the political disasters of the following decades, with a loyalty that asked more of her than most people would have managed. The breakdown came in 1930. Philip was 9 years old. His mother had begun in the late 1920s to behave in ways that her family found increasingly alarming. She had visions. She believed she had been chosen for a healing mission. She believed she could cure the sick through the laying on of hands. She gave away her possessions. She wore the habit of a Greek Orthodox nun for extended periods and refused to remove it. Her brothers, her husband, and the network of related royal families who had been watching with growing concern, decided in the spring of 1930 that the behavior could no longer be explained by religious conviction alone. In May of that year, a German psychiatrist named Ernst Simmel was consulted at the house in Saint-Cloud and recommended residential assessment. Princess Alice was taken to the Bellevue Sanatorium at Kreuzlingen in Switzerland, against her resistance and with what contemporary accounts describe as considerable physical coercion. The sanatorium was run by the distinguished psychiatrist Ludwig Binswanger, who diagnosed her with paranoid schizophrenia. Binswanger shared the case notes with Sigmund Freud, who responded in a letter that has since acquired a certain notoriety in the history of psychoanalysis. Freud suggested the delusions were rooted in sexual frustration and recommended irradiation of her ovaries to suppress the libido. The irradiation was carried out. She remained at Bellevue and at subsequent Swiss institutions for approximately 2 years, returning to her own life quietly in the mid-1930s. Philip did not see his mother for 5 years after she was taken to Switzerland. His father's departure from family life predated the formal collapse by some years. The combination meant that by the autumn of 1930, Philip's situation was as follows. He was 9 years old. His mother was confined to a Swiss sanatorium. His father was moving toward Monaco, and a permanent absence that would last until his death. His 4 sisters were moving into German princely marriages, Margarita to Gottfried of Hohenlohe-Langenburg, Theodora to Berthold, Margrave of Baden, Cecilia to Georg Donatus of Hesse, Sophie to Christoph of Hesse. 3 of these brothers-in-law had connections to the apparatus of German politics that was hardening by the year into something the rest of the world would spend 6 years fighting. Their mother did not attend any of the weddings. The arrangement for Philip was made by his mother's family, the Mountbattens. Her brother George, the second Marquis of Milford Haven, took on primary responsibility. Philip would be educated in England. He would spend school holidays at Linden Manor in Berkshire with his uncle George, and later at Kensington Palace with his grandmother Victoria, the Marchioness of Milford Haven. He would be a Mountbatten in practice, if not in designation. He was sent to Cheam School in Surrey in 1928. From Cheam he went to Salem School in Germany in 1933, where his sister Theodora's connection to the school's patron, Berthold of Baden, meant the fees were waived. The school had been founded by the philosopher and educator Kurt Hahn on principles of character formation through challenge and hardship. It also had, by 1933, the disadvantage of being located in a country whose new government was changing everything around it. Hahn, who was Jewish, was arrested and forced to flee. Boys were required to perform the Hitler salute on entering and leaving classrooms. Philip, by his own later account, found the salute ridiculous and refused to give it. He was disciplined. The decision was made to move him. Gordonston was the school Hahn rebuilt after his escape from Germany, established on the Moray coast of Scotland, on the same principles he had developed at Salem: cold showers, long runs, sailing in the North Sea, manual labor, a deliberate austerity of daily life, intended to produce in young men the qualities that Hahn believed comfort and family protection had trained out of them. Philip arrived in the autumn of 1934, at the age of 13, and he thrived in a way that surprised no one who had been watching him manage his disrupted life for the previous 5 years. Gordonston offered something he had not had in any sustained form since Mon Repos: structure that rewarded competence rather than rank. The cold showers were, for a boy who had learned to absorb discomfort as a basic social skill, something closer to pleasure than punishment. The long runs were release. The sailing was the discovery of what would become one of the central physical pleasures of his adult life. He won the Burleigh Cup for athletics. He captained the cricket team and the hockey team. He was made head boy, which the school called guardian. He learned from Hahn personally the educational philosophy that he would later attempt to apply to his own eldest son, with results that the son would spend decades describing as damage. Hahn taught the stripping away of family protection as liberation. Philip received it as liberation. Charles would receive it as abandonment. During the Gordonston years, 3 events shaped the rest of his life in ways that nothing afterward fully resolved. The first was the death of his sister Cecilia in November 1937. She was 26, 8 months pregnant with her 4th child, traveling by aircraft from Frankfurt to London for a family wedding. The Sabina Junkers Jew 52 carrying her husband Georg Donatus of Hesse, their 2 eldest sons Ludwig aged 6 and Alexander aged 4, and Georg Donatus's mother, came down in fog near Ostend, Belgium. Everyone aboard was killed. A premature infant, apparently delivered on impact, was found beside Cecilia's body in the wreckage. Philip was 16 years old. He was taken from Gordonston to the funeral in Darmstadt. The photographs from that funeral have disturbed every biographer who has encountered them. Philip in school uniform walks behind the coffins between columns of men in Nazi dress uniform. His brother-in-law Christoph of Hesse held the rank of Oberführer in the SS and served in Hermann Göring's intelligence service. Another brother-in-law, Berthold of Baden, had also served on the German side. The swastika armbands appear in every surviving image. Philip wrote in later life that he had heard the news of the crash in his headmaster's study at Gordonston, and that the shock was among the most vivid and painful memories of his life. He did not write, and never seemed to speak about publicly, what it had been like to walk through that particular funeral with those particular symbols on the uniforms of the men around him. The second event was the death of his uncle and principal guardian, George Mountbatten, the 2nd Marquess of Milford Haven, in April 1938. George was 46 and had been ill with bone marrow cancer. His death meant that the primary adult figure who had managed Philip's welfare since the family collapsed was gone. The responsibility transferred to George's brother, Louis Mountbatten, known universally as Dickie, who was at that point a captain in the Royal Navy, and whose career and complicated marriage left him limited bandwidth for a grieving nephew. He did what he could. Philip learned, again, to manage on his own. The third event was a single afternoon at the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, in July 1939. Philip was 18 and a naval cadet. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth brought their 2 daughters to visit the college: Princess Elizabeth, 13 years old, and Princess Margaret Rose, 8. There was a chickenpox outbreak among the cadets. The princesses were confined to the captain's house. Dickie Mountbatten, who was on the king's staff that day, and who had been engineering this introduction for some time, suggested that a cadet be sent to entertain the young princesses. The cadet sent up was his nephew. Philip was tall, fair-haired, blue-eyed, and by every account at that point of his life, very good-looking, in the way that physical confidence and outdoor living produce in young men who are also intelligent enough to be amusing. He demonstrated how to jump over the tennis net, He showed the princesses how to play croquet. He talked. He moved around with the easy assurance of someone who had learned that making people comfortable with you was a survival skill, not a social grace. His cousin Margaret Rhodes, who was present, and who retained the memory clearly more than 70 years later, said simply that Elizabeth fell in love with him that day. Philip, looking back at the same afternoon, consistently said he had felt nothing in particular. He had jumped over the net. He had eaten the strawberries. He had returned to the cadets' quarters. He had not, as he told it later, given the quiet, watchful, 13-year-old princess a second thought. This may be accurate. It may also be the account of a man who found it difficult to describe vulnerability in any form except as retrospective comedy. What is certain is that Elizabeth had given him considerable thought, that she began writing to him when the war started, that the letters became warmer over time, and that by 1946 he was writing to her that she was the only thing in this world which is absolutely real to me. He wrote to her mother that falling in love with Elizabeth, completely and unreservedly, had made all his past struggles seem small. The marriage that came from it was real. The love was real. The letters were real. Every biographer who has read the correspondence has confirmed this without reservation. Philip spent the war years in the Royal Navy, progressing through the machinery of a service that was, in the early 1940s, the most professionally demanding and physically dangerous institution available to a young man who needed somewhere to point the energy that Gordonston had developed. He served in the Mediterranean from 1940. He was mentioned in dispatches after the Battle of Cape Matapan in March 1941, when his operation of the searchlights on HMS Valiant contributed to the destruction of 3 Italian heavy cruisers at night. He was 19. The dispatches mentioned him by name. It was one of the few moments in his young life when recognition had attached to something he had done entirely on his own terms, without the complication of ancestry or institutional position qualifying it. He served subsequently in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, reaching Australia in 1943 on HMS Wallace. He was appointed First Lieutenant of HMS Whelp in 1944 and participated in the D-Day operations. He watched the formal Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September 1945 from the deck of HMS Duke of York as part of the British Pacific Fleet. He was 24 years old. Between these years of sustained operational service, he and Elizabeth exchanged letters. The letters were the only form of sustained connection available to them during the war years. He addressed her as Lilibet. She addressed him as Philip. The correspondence that biographers have read in full and quoted from partially describes two people constructing a relationship through language over the 5 years that separated the Dartmouth afternoon from the formal engagement announcement in July 1947. The engagement was not straightforward to arrange. George VI had reservations. His wife had reservations of a different kind. Philip's family background, with 3 sisters who had married into German aristocratic families with documented connections to the National Socialist state, was a complication requiring careful handling in the political atmosphere of 1946 and 1947. His naturalization as a British citizen, giving up his Greek and Danish titles in the process, was completed in February 1947. He became Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, Royal Navy. His uncle Dickie Mountbatten had managed the negotiation with the precision of someone who had been working toward this outcome for several years, and who had the specific skill of making inevitable-seeming results appear to emerge naturally from circumstances rather than from sustained pressure. The wedding at Westminster Abbey on the 20th of November 1947 was broadcast on radio to an audience the BBC estimated at 200 million listeners worldwide. Philip was made Duke of Edinburgh, Earl of Merioneth, and Baron Greenwich in the hours before the ceremony. He gave his first speech as the Queen's husband at the wedding breakfast, addressing it to the most beautiful woman alive. The Malta years from 1949 to 1951, when Philip commanded HMS Magpie as a lieutenant commander and Elizabeth lived with him at the Villa Guardamangia in Guzay, outside Valletta, were the period that everyone who knew them described as the happiest of their early married life. Charles and Anne were in England with the household. The ceremonial obligations of being heir presumptive and her naval officer husband were, by the measure of what their subsequent life would demand, genuinely modest. They lived as Philip had always wanted to live, in a position where his professional competence was the primary thing being assessed, and where the institutional apparatus of the Crown competed only minimally for Elizabeth's attention and for the shape of their days. There are photographs from Malta that biographies reproduce because they show both of them with an ease that later photographs of official life do not quite replicate. He looks like a naval officer in a warm climate, who is where he belongs. She looks like a naval officer's wife, who has discovered she is good at it. They are not performing for anyone. The photographs preserve something about that period that both of them appear to have known would not last. Philip commanded HMS Magpie with the specific pleasure of someone who had been given back, temporarily, the kind of authority that the institutional machinery of the palace removed. He made decisions on Magpie that were evaluated by whether they worked rather than by whether they were appropriate for someone of his rank and position. He raced the ship informally against other vessels and won by margins that gave the win a decisiveness his crew talked about for years afterward. The competitiveness was real, and it was unceremonious in the way that genuine competition is unceremonious. It had nothing to do with anyone watching. Elizabeth shopped in Valletta without a security detail. She drove herself around the island in a small car, which was something that became impossible for her the morning of the 6th of February 1952, and that she never did again. The freedom of those years was the freedom of a life not yet fully claimed by the thing it was about to become, and both of them appear to have understood that they were in an interval that would eventually close, rather than a condition that would continue. The officers and their wives who saw the two of them at the naval community's social events during the Malta posting described a couple at ease with each other, in the specific way that couples who are actually spending time together are at ease, rather than the managed ease of couples performing a relationship for an audience. They argued, because Philip argued with most people he spent significant time with, and the arguments appear from the accounts of observers to have been conducted on relatively equal terms, which is not what arguing on equal terms with the future queen looked like later in their life, when the institutional weight of her position had fully settled. The Malta years were the last time Philip operated inside a professional role that was evaluated by professional standards, the last time his competence rather than his compliance was the primary measure being applied. He understood this. Several biographers have recorded versions of the observation Philip made in later life about those years, the specific regret not for the personal freedom, but for the professional measure, for the years when someone could hand him a task and evaluate him on whether he had done it well. He missed being evaluated on whether he had done things well. The ceremonial role did not provide that. It ended before dawn on the 6th of February 1952. They were at treetops in Kenya when the message arrived that King George VI had died in his sleep at Sandringham. Philip was told first. He woke Elizabeth. She said nothing for a long moment. She walked to the window. When she turned back, she asked what she was supposed to do. Philip had no answer. He took her outside, and they stood on the balcony, looking at the African bush in the pre-dawn dark. When they went back inside, the practical machinery of accession had already begun to move. Philip told a biographer years later that the Malta period ended that morning. It ended in the specific way that something ends when the condition that made it possible is permanently removed rather than temporarily interrupted. He would not return to active naval service. He had reached the rank of commander. The institution had claimed his wife, and in claiming her, it claimed him. The nature of what the institution had claimed was something Philip spent decades examining, in the indirect way available to a man who would not discuss his inner life publicly, but whose actions and occasional private comments allowed biographers to assemble a picture. The institution had claimed his time, his name, his professional trajectory, his calendar, his agenda, his household, his children's surname, and his place in every public room he entered, which was always and without exception the place 2 steps behind his wife. The institution had left him the private version, which was not nothing, because the private version was where he was allowed to be himself, rather than a function. The long solo voyages of the 1950s were the most prolonged versions of the private version, operating without the institutional apparatus immediately surrounding it. The Britannia was the Queen's yacht, and its voyages were official in their designations and their destinations, but the yacht itself provided something that no land-based portion of Philip's official life provided: hours and days of water between himself and the attention of the press and the ceremonial obligations of the calendar. He was at sea. The sea did not require him to perform. The specific voyage of October 1956 to February 1957 was 4 months at sea in the Antarctic and the Pacific. Philip was 35. He had been the Duke of Edinburgh for 9 years. He had been walking 2 steps behind his wife, in public ceremonies, for 4 years since the accession. He had delivered the speech at his own wedding addressing the most beautiful woman alive, and then watched, in the years that followed, as the woman became less accessible by the year to anything that resembled the private version of their life together. Malta had been the private version. The coronation was the public version, claiming everything. The voyage gave him the sea and the formal pretext of royal duty, and the distance from London, that distance at sea provides. What it gave Parker, who was aboard, was the specific problem of the American press coverage that the voyage generated. The reports of a rift in the royal marriage, published without clear attribution and without the documentary support that would have made them actionable. Parker managed the problem on the yacht. The palace managed it from London. Elizabeth flew to Lisbon. Philip was formally made Prince of the United Kingdom 6 days after Elén Parker filed her divorce papers. The sequence of events across those 6 weeks, from the American press report through Parker's resignation, to Elizabeth's arrival in Lisbon, to Philip's formal designation, was the most concentrated public management exercise the palace had conducted around the question of Philip's private life since the marriage began. It was conducted with the efficiency that the institution had spent centuries developing, and it worked. The rift story did not gain the traction it needed to become the story the press most wanted it to be. The reunion in Lisbon provided the photographs. The formal designation provided the context. The story moved elsewhere. What remained was the changed character of Philip's immediate private world. Parker was gone. Nahum was dead. The Thursday Club was winding down. The official circle and the private circle had, for the first time in his adult life, no designated manager for the gap between them. Philip built the replacement himself, without a designated manager, one individual connection at a time. He was 35. He had another 54 years to build it in. The name dispute that followed within a year of the accession brought his position into focus in a way that the ceremonial weeks immediately after the king's death had managed to obscure. The convention of British royal succession meant that the dynasty's name, Windsor, descended through the children. Philip's own name, Mountbatten, was not passed on to them. He raised the objection formally. Winston Churchill, as Prime Minister, supported the retention of Windsor. Queen Mary, whose opinions carried institutional weight in the months before her death in March 1953, supported Windsor. The royal household supported Windsor. Philip's objection was noted, received, and set aside. He said, in the account he gave to a biographer years later, and with the flatness of a man describing something he had metabolized, rather than something still raw, that he felt like nothing but a bloody amoeba. An amoeba has no fixed form. It takes the shape of whatever contains it. The consort's role, designed for a woman supporting a male sovereign and never fully adapted for the inverse situation, required Philip to take whatever form the institution provided. The compromise, a hyphenated form allowing Mountbatten Windsor as a surname for descendants without royal titles, was reached years later when both Churchill and Queen Mary were no longer available to object. By then, Philip had absorbed the outcome the way he absorbed all institutional losses, without public complaint, with a comment that people repeated for decades, and by finding something to build. The Duke of Edinburgh's award, established in 1956, was the clearest expression of what he built from the material of his own formation. The Kurt Hahn philosophy of challenge and self-reliance that he had received at Gordonston became the basis of a youth development program that expanded across decades into the largest of its kind in the world. It was his. It bore his name. No institutional decision could remove it. The private circle was built alongside all of this, not instead of it. The two lives ran in parallel, the public one documented in the court circular, and the private one that the circle protected. Neither negated the other. They ran together for the rest of his life, each requiring the other's existence as a condition of the whole arrangement remaining intact. The specific texture of Philip's daily life as consort is something that the court circular documents in its way, and that biographers have assembled from the accounts of household staff and official observers, and Philip's own occasional remarks. The court circular lists appointments and attendances, and dedications, and official openings. It does not record what Philip thought of them, though his thoughts were available on request to anyone who asked him directly, because Philip did not maintain the fiction that the ceremonial functions of his role were the things he found most meaningful. He attended. He performed the functions correctly. He made clear to the people around him that the performance was a function, rather than an expression of genuine preference. He found genuine preference elsewhere. His reading was wide and sometimes surprising. He was interested in the philosophy of science and in the relationship between empirical evidence and theoretical interpretation, in ways that made him, in the 1960s and 70s, an engaged participant in the public debates about ecology and environmental management that were then emerging. He established the World Wildlife Fund's British chapter in 1961, an engagement that went well beyond the ceremonial patronage that royal figures typically extended to charitable causes. He read the science, he argued about the methodology, he pushed the organizations he was involved with in directions that reflected genuine intellectual engagement rather than reputational association. He was interested in the history of exploration and in the technical and organizational challenges that sustained exploration across extreme environments produced. He was interested in theology, not in the devotional sense but in the philosophical sense of the discipline that addresses the largest questions available for human attention. He had conversations about these subjects with people who shared the interest, and the conversations were substantive rather than ceremonial, according to the accounts of the people who participated in them. The women in his circle who mattered most to him intellectually were the ones who could engage at this level. Du Maurier, who thought carefully about questions of identity and self-deception; Sasha, who brought the Jungian framework and the practical experience of applying it in a community under pressure; and Penny, who had the kind of direct intelligence that does not require the support of formal frameworks. He was not looking for agreement. He was looking for the kind of genuine intellectual push that most of the people in his official social world, who were careful not to challenge him on anything that might be mistaken for impudence, were not in a position to provide. The private circle provided it. That was not the only thing it provided, and it was not the thing that the press speculated about, and it was not the thing that the palace managed against, but it was a real and sustained provision, and its absence from the official version of what the friendships were is part of what makes the official version inadequate as a full account. In the engineering facilities and scientific establishments he visited, with enough frequency that their staff remembered him as someone who asked real questions rather than the politely interested questions his position technically required. In the polo fields of the 1950s and 60s, where he rode with the competitive seriousness of someone who had decided that playing a sport well enough to matter was more important than playing it safely enough to preserve a royal dignity. In the cockpits of the aircraft, he flew from 1952 until 1997, logging over 5,000 hours of flight time and becoming the first member of the royal family to fly across the Atlantic. In the carriage driving circuits of the final 3 decades of his active life, where he competed internationally, and where the standard he set for himself and the people around him was the standard genuine competition demands rather than the standard ceremonial participation permits. These were the contexts where Philip was most recognizably himself. They were contexts of active physical and intellectual engagement, where the requirement was performance in the literal rather than the ceremonial sense, doing a thing correctly and to the standard the thing itself demands. They were also, several of them, the contexts in which the people in his private circle encountered him most sustainedly. The carriage driving gave the friendship with Penny its practical structure. The intellectual seriousness gave the friendship with Sacha Abercorn its shared language. The engagement with accomplished people in their own professional domains gave the friendships with Elén and Du Maurier and Pat Kirkwood their initial character. The man most visible in those contexts was not the Duke of Edinburgh of the court circular. He was the person Elizabeth had fallen in love with at Dartmouth in 1939, and had written to through the war years, and had married, knowing that the institutional demands of the position she would inherit would require him to become something that the person she had fallen in love with had not been trained to be. She had married him anyway. The calculation she had made in 1947 was the calculation that Hicks described 7 decades later, that the man was worth the complication, and that the complication was manageable, and that the management of it was something she was capable of. She was right on all 3 counts. The household staff who served the couple across decades, the people who had access to the private version of the marriage, and to both of the people inside it on a daily basis, provided accounts to the biographers who eventually sought them that are consistent in their characterization of Philip's qualities and inconsistent in their characterization of his moods. The qualities were constant: the directness, the energy, the specific form of attention he extended to people whose abilities he respected, the intolerance of pretension, the humor, which was pointed and quick, and capable of finding the precise absurdity in any situation and naming it before anyone else had located it. The moods were not constant. Philip had a temper that the people around him learned to read from specific indicators and to accommodate by the technique of not provoking it further and not taking it personally. He was not cruel. He was not the kind of person who directed the temper at people who were unable to defend themselves. But he was the kind of person who expressed frustration with the institutional machinery and the ceremonial obligations and the specific forms of stupidity he encountered in the performance of his official functions, with an directness that the people around him found both alarming and, in retrospect, consistently honest. He said what he thought. He thought things that were not always comfortable. The household staff who served in the private portions of the royal calendar, at Balmoral and Sandringham, and at Windsor for the occasions where the official world was less present, described the private Philip as warmer than the public one, in the specific way that people who maintain a protective public persona are warmer in private, not fundamentally different, but more fully present, more willing to engage with the actual rather than the required. He talked to the staff. He remembered details from previous conversations. He asked about the things he had been told and expected to find out whether those things had resolved or progressed. These are the qualities of someone who was genuinely interested in the people around him, rather than performing interest as a social technique. The women in his private circle would have recognized this quality, because it was the quality they had each encountered when Philip turned it toward them. He was genuinely interested in what Sasha was thinking about Jung, and what Elén was doing on television, and what Penny was finding in the carriage driving. The interest was real, not performed, and the realness of it was what made each connection sustain itself across the decades it sustained itself across. People can tell the difference between genuine interest and performed interest. The people in Philip's circle had been receiving the genuine version long enough to know what it felt like, and to find its absence in other contexts noticeable. It was not the only real thing in Philip's life. The other real things were the ones his circle spent their lives either protecting or carefully allowing to show. Consider the specific geometry of that circle, and what it contained. Elén Cordet published a memoir in 1962 about her own life. She was, by that point, a recognizable face in British households, having appeared on BBC television through the 1950s in a program called Café Continental, which recreated the atmosphere of a continental cabaret for audiences who had never visited one. She hosted it with the ease of someone who had actually grown up in the world she was presenting, because she had. She was not a marginal person writing about a marginal connection. She was a prominent public figure writing about a prominent relationship. And when she reached the pages of her memoir that should have addressed the question of her children's paternity, the question that every reviewer and journalist and reader who opened the book was waiting for her to answer, she left a blank. Not a denial, not an explanation. A space where the answer should have been held open with the deliberate precision of someone who has decided that the space itself is the most honest thing she can offer. Her son Max became a professor of strategic management at the ESADE Business School in Barcelona. When journalists found him and asked about the paternity question, he was clear and specific. He denied any connection between himself and Prince Philip and attributed his paternity to Marcel Boisseau, the free French pilot who had married Elén after the war. He said the rumors were ridiculous. He died in 2011, with his account unchanged. The denial is clear. The question of why it needed to be made at all, why a man who was simply the son of a wartime French pilot and a Greek cabaret singer was receiving paternity questions from journalists for decades, receives its most plausible answer from the blank at the center of his mother's memoir. Philip paid the school fees for Max's education at Gordonston, the Scottish school he himself had attended. He did not pay through an intermediary. He paid personally. He was godfather to Max, and godfather to Max's sister Louise as well, a doubled godparent commitment for children whose documented father was alive and present throughout their childhood. These facts are not disputed. What they mean is something that neither the Cordet family nor the palace has chosen to specify, and the not specifying has lasted more than 60 years. Pat Kirkwood knew exactly what one evening with a prince could cost a woman whose reputation depended on the public's willingness to separate her professional self from her private life. She had dinner with Philip in October 1948. She danced with him until dawn. Princess Elizabeth was 8 months pregnant with Prince Charles that evening. None of this is disputed. What Kirkwood wanted, for the 59 years that followed, was for Philip to stand up publicly and say what was true, that the connection had gone no further than one late evening, and that the story the press had built from it was false. He never said it. He could have. He chose not to. When she wrote to him asking him to say it, his response was that short of starting libel proceedings, there was absolutely nothing to be done. The letter acknowledged the problem and offered no solution. She spent the rest of her career addressing the same question in interview after interview. She died on Christmas Day 2007, having received nothing from Philip by way of public support. He outlived her by more than 13 years. The Thursday Club met every Thursday lunchtime at Wheeler's Restaurant on Old Compton Street in Soho, in a neighborhood that respectable people did not visit in the late 1940s without a specific reason. The reason the members had was the room upstairs, which the owner, Bernard Walsh, held for them, and which provided the conditions the proceedings required: adequate alcohol, no press, and a guest list that could include Kim Philby, who was at that point running a Soviet intelligence operation from inside MI6, and the Cray twins, who were at that point running Southeast London, and Philip, who was the husband of the woman who would be Queen. The fact that these people occupied the same room without apparent friction says something about the particular social world of post-war London that later decades find genuinely difficult to account for. What Philip got from the club was practice. Practice in maintaining the gap between the public and the private. Practice in operating in a social world where the performance of the Duke of Edinburgh was not what was being asked for. Practice in managing the architecture of a life conducted in two registers simultaneously, each complete in itself, each requiring different skills and different company, without either register being allowed to render the other impossible. Those skills did not leave him when the club dissolved. They informed everything that came afterward. Sacha Abercorn told a biographer that her relationship with Philip had been a passionate friendship. She said this without being prompted, in a context where no one had directly asked her whether the passion had been physical. She then added that the passion had been in the ideas. She then added that it had certainly not been a full relationship. She then added, as the fourth and final component of a statement doing considerable work, that she had not gone to bed with him. A person who has not gone to bed with someone they are discussing does not normally specify, unprompted, that they have not gone to bed with them. The specification exists because the assumption existed, and the assumption existed because the connection was visible and sustained and intense enough that the assumption was reasonable. She was a Jungian psychologist who had thought carefully about the theory of the persona and the shadow, the public performance and the private self that the performance conceals. Philip was a man who had been performing a specific public persona since 1947 and who maintained a private self alongside it, with the discipline of someone who had learned to do this not as a preference, but as a survival requirement. The meeting of those two people at Barons Court in County Tyrone, across decades of conversations, was the meeting of two people with a shared language for the problem Philip had been living with his entire professional life. Sacha's carefully structured statement declines to say what the shared language produced beyond conversation, while making clear that there was something it needed to not be misunderstood as having produced. The public places were different from the private ones. In the public places, Philip performed. He performed with skill and genuine capability because he was not a stupid man and not an untalented one. His official public persona, the blunt, impatient, occasionally rude figure, whose gaffes were collected and reprinted as evidence of his disregard for diplomatic convention, was not entirely a construction. The bluntness was real. The impatience was real. The gaffes were the product of genuine views expressed, without the filter the position technically required. But the figure those qualities composed was a construction as much as any other public image, and constructions protect the things behind them by being more visible than what they conceal. When Philip told a journalist in 1992 that for 40 years he had never moved anywhere without a policeman, and asked how he could possibly have gotten away with anything of the kind the journalist was implying, he was using the construction precisely. He was placing the argument in a frame where it looked like a refutation. The journalist was meant to feel that the question had been answered. What had actually happened was a demonstration of how Philip managed the territory between what people wanted to know and what he was willing to say. He had been managing it since 1947. He was very good at it. The geographic argument, if you want to understand Philip's private life from the outside, is this. There were places where Philip appeared most like the person his correspondence with Elizabeth had described: direct, warm, capable of genuine feeling, interested in the texture of other people's lives rather than their usefulness to his position. Those places were mostly not official ones. They were the upper room at Wheeler's in Soho. They were Barons Court in County Tyrone. They were the carriage driving course at Windsor, where he spent mornings that the press documented since the mid-1980s, with a regularity suggesting a fixed appointment. They were whatever dressing room or restaurant or private house Nahum had arranged access to on any given evening, before the police presence made arrangement complicated. The cost of maintaining two versions of his life simultaneously was not borne only by Philip. It was distributed across the people who held the private version for him. Pat Kirkwood bore a portion in public, across 59 years of interviews, in which the same question recurred, and she answered it with the same combination of denial and wounded restraint. Elén Cordet bore hers privately, in the silence she maintained around the central question of her memoir, and in the decades of rumors she never publicly addressed. Sacha Abercorn bore the social implication of a sustained friendship with a married royal, and addressed it, in the end, with the careful past statement that resolved only the literal version of the question, while leaving the rest where it was. Penny Natchbull bore 30 years of tabloid attention, photographed at Philip's side at horse shows and garden parties, with the sustained visibility that generates its own interpretation, regardless of what the official explanation offers. The Queen bore a portion too, though her portion was different from the others. Pamela Hicks, who knew both of them across decades, told Sally Bedell Smith that the Queen understood Philip very well and recognized his friendships for what they were, and knew it was absolutely nothing. This was not offered as apologetics. It was the considered judgment of an exceptionally perceptive woman who had married Philip knowing he was constitutionally resistant to containment, and who had built a marriage that lasted longer than almost any other partnership in modern royal history, by working with his nature rather than against it. What his circle found in him was more various and more private than what the official version of his life made visible. Several of them carried the connection for their entire lives without releasing it. That choice, the choice to hold rather than release, tells us something about what was being held. People do not maintain silence across decades about things that do not matter to them. The things that Elén and Pat Kirkwood and Sacha and Penny chose to hold mattered to them, for reasons that each of them understood differently, but that all of them appear to have found more important than the alternative of releasing what they had been holding. The accounting for those reasons, which is what any honest history of Philip's circle requires, produces a picture that is more complicated and more specifically human than the official version allowed itself to be during his lifetime. It is a picture of a man who needed more than the official version could provide, who found the people who could provide it, and who maintained those connections with the same tenacious consistency that he maintained everything he valued. That is the account that follows. Elén Foufounis, who would later take the professional name Elén Cordet, was born in Marseille on the 3rd of July 1917. Her family was Greek, with deep French connections, and they occupied a specific place in the social world of the Greek exile community that gathered in Paris after the political upheavals of the early 1920s. When the Greek royal family was expelled from their country, the Foufounis family was among those who helped the displaced royals settle into the practical realities of reduced exile life. Philip's parents, Princess Alice and Prince Andrew, were among the people they assisted during the early years in France. This connection was not social networking or opportunism. It was the practical solidarity of Greek families stranded in Paris without a country, helping each other manage. Elén was 4 years older than Philip. They grew up in the same exile circle, meeting through family visits during holidays at Le Touquet and through the suburban Paris social life that the Greek expatriate community sustained across the 1920s and early 1930s. She knew him as a child. He knew her family as the family who had helped his. Later, during Philip's school years in England, he visited the Foufounis flat in London regularly, by several accounts including visits where he helped prepare meals and washed up afterward. That detail has appeared in multiple accounts of the relationship, and it is the detail that most clearly establishes the character of the connection, before anyone tried to make it sound significant, in ways it was not. A future royal husband was not being received as visiting royalty at the Foufounis flat. He was in the kitchen. He was hungry after school. He was in a house where nobody needed him to represent anything, where the people around him had known his family since before the palace got involved. where conversation could happen in Greek or French without ceremony, and where the ordinary texture of a meal with familiar people was available to him in a life where ordinary texture was not abundant. This is what the phrase family friend meant in Philip's case, before the phrase got borrowed by people who wanted to use it as a way of dismissing the connection. In lives shaped by displacement and exile, the families you were close to, the ones who fed you and made room for you, and remembered you before you belonged to a national story, those connections had a weight that casual social acquaintance did not. Philip had very little of the stable, continuous emotional texture of ordinary childhood. The Fufuni's household gave him some of it. That was not trivial. When Elén married for the first time, the dates in the surviving sources are slightly imprecise, but she was around 20 years old, and Philip was approximately 16 or 17. The wedding required someone to give the bride away in the Greek Orthodox ceremony. The obvious candidates were not available or were otherwise occupied. Philip, who understood what the moment required, and who had by that age developed the particular quality of stepping forward when form demanded it, offered to perform the role. He hired a Daimler for the occasion, appeared in a borrowed morning suit and top hat, and escorted Elén through the ceremony with the gravity that a teenage boy can produce when he has decided something matters. After the ceremony, according to a newspaper account from the period, he exhaled with relief and announced that it was an awful business, getting married. Elén's mother told him he would do it himself one day. He grinned and said no fear. The photograph from that wedding became, in retrospect, a significant image in the whole question of what Philip's connection to Elén actually was. He was not a peripheral figure in a large wedding party. He was the person at her shoulder performing the role of the person who matters most at that moment in the ceremony. The roots of the relationship were too visible in that image for the palace to comfortably dismiss the connection as a passing social overlap, even though the palace would spend the following decades doing exactly that. During the war years, London drew the old circle back together in a different configuration. The city in 1940 and 1941, and through the subsequent years of the Blitz, was a strange environment for social life, simultaneously dangerous and intensely social, rationed and yet crowded, frightened and resilient in the way that cities which have decided to survive tend to be. Greek exiles and free French officers and British artists and writers and performers and the scattered fragments of continental aristocracy who had ended up in London by various routes of escape and obligation, circulated through the same clubs and restaurants and drawing rooms. Elén moved through that world with ease. She had the cosmopolitan fluency of someone trained by displacement to inhabit whatever room she found herself in. Her first marriage had failed by the early 1940s. Sometime around this period, she had her first child, a son she named Max. The exact year is not fixed in all sources with the same precision. Her second child, a daughter named Louise, was born on the 8th of February 1945. Their documented father was Marcel Boisseau, a captain in the Free French Air Force who had flown a Marine 315 training aircraft from Morocco to Gibraltar in 1940 without navigation equipment or maps, and who later became Elén's second husband. Philip became godfather to both children. He paid for Max to attend Gordonston, the same Scottish school he himself had attended, meeting the fees directly and personally, rather than through any intermediary arrangement. Max and Louise grew up knowing Philip as Uncle Philip. The combination of facts, the godfather relationship for both children rather than one, the specific choice of Gordonston for Max, the payment of fees directly rather than through some more arm's-length mechanism, the sustained connection between Philip and Elén through the post-war years when the engagement to Elizabeth was becoming public, generated a persistent question about who Max and Louise's father actually was. T-Down, Max Boisseau, when this question was put to him directly in later life, was on the record and specific. He said the rumors were ridiculous. He said his real father was in Paris. He said the whole thing traced back to a childhood friendship and nothing more. He was a professor of strategic management at the Assad Business School in Barcelona when he said this, and he died on the 7th of September 2011 without changing his account. In the early 1960s, Elén published a memoir in London titled Born Bewildered. The book was reviewed politely and sold modestly and contained, somewhere in its pages, an engagement with the question of her children's paternity. What it contained was a refusal to answer that question. The silence is not evidence of anything in particular. Silence proves nothing either way, but it is a choice. and the choice to sustain that silence across 5 decades of memoir writing and journalism and biographical inquiry speaks to something about the nature of the connection that Elén was not willing to resolve in either direction for the public. Max's denial was specific and on the record. Elén's silence was consistent and complete. Neither changes what Philip's behavior documented: the godfather relationship for both children, the personal payment of school fees at his own former school, the sustained contact through the years when a man recently married to the future Queen of England might have been expected to manage his association with a Greek cabaret singer who was raising questions about her children's paternity. What Elén's silence most plausibly represents is the same thing it has always represented: an extraordinarily close friendship between two people who had shared the same formless, parentless, stateless displacement of early life, and who maintained the connection built from that shared condition long after Philip's circumstances changed beyond anything either of them could have predicted when they were eating meals together in the Paris suburbs. He had known her before the palace claimed him. In Philip's life, which had been rearranged so many times by forces he did not control, the people who had known him before the claiming was the most permanent thing he had. Elén Cordet died in Switzerland in April 1996 at the age of 78, having maintained the same position for 5 decades. What she had maintained across those 5 decades was not the silence of someone with something to hide in the ordinary sense. It was an active stance requiring renewal each time a journalist approached, or a biographer wrote, or a television program ran about Prince Philip and his circle. The renewal was made consistently. She said nothing to confirm and nothing to deny, and she maintained that position from the mid-1950s, when Philip's public prominence made the connection newsworthy, until her death. Her public identity through the period when the questions were most frequent was built entirely on her own work. The BBC program she hosted, Café Continental, recreated the atmosphere of a continental cabaret for British audiences who had not experienced one, and who were, in the early years of television, receptive to anything that came to them through the new medium, with a host who appeared to actually belong to the world she was presenting. Elén had that quality. She had grown up in the world the program was recreating. The ease she projected was not constructed for the camera. It was the ease of someone genuinely at home. Philip's visits continued through this period, maintained in the margins of official schedules with the specific discretion that only someone of his position and the staff loyalty that position commanded could arrange and sustain. His biographers note the connection without fully documenting the mechanics of these visits. That the visits happened is established. Their specific character is not preserved in any publicly available record. What the connection most clearly demonstrates, placed alongside everything else the record shows about Philip's private social life, is the specific character of his loyalty to the people who had known him before the palace claimed him. He did not make gestures. He made commitments and sustained them. The school fees were not a one-time payment. They were maintained across the years of Max's education at Gordonstoun, years during which a Duke of Edinburgh with a growing public calendar was choosing, repeatedly, to direct personal resources and attention toward a connection the institution would not have sanctioned if the institution had been asked. The doubled godparent commitment is the detail that speaks most directly. Godparents are chosen for individual children. To be godfather to both Max and Louise was to make a doubled personal declaration about the nature of the responsibility Philip felt for their welfare. Whatever that feeling was rooted in, it was real enough to produce sustained action across years, which is the only reliable measure of what any feeling actually is. Max Boisseau built a distinguished academic career in management research. He maintained his position on the paternity question across the decades in which it was occasionally raised, and maintained it without apparent strain, as someone who had settled the matter for himself and saw no reason to revisit it for the benefit of external curiosity. His death in 2011 resolved the public discussion without resolving the underlying question, which was the outcome his mother had arranged for the question 49 years before, when she published the memoir with the blank at its center. Elén had understood, in that choice, something that the tabloid press had also understood about her connection to Philip, that a denial gives a story fresh oxygen. A blank stops the air supply. She gave the story no oxygen for 5 decades, and the question accordingly never died, but also never caught fire in the way a documented answer in either direction would have allowed. She refused the fire. She held the blank. She died in April 1996 in Switzerland, having held it for 34 years since the memoir's publication and for over 40 years since the questions had begun. Philip outlived her by 25 years. What that long survival meant to him is not recorded in any form accessible to the public record. Pat Kirkwood was born Patricia Kirkwood on the 24th of February 1921 in Pendleton in Salford, Lancashire. By the time the night that would define the second half of her life arrived, she was the most celebrated female performer on the British stage. The critic Kenneth Tynan, reviewing her in the early 1950s, described her legs as the eighth wonder of the world. The description attached itself to her permanently and followed every subsequent mention of her career, which was probably both a compliment and an enclosure, the kind of notice that tells a performer she has arrived and also tells her where the walls are. She had performed at the London Palladium during the Blitz, standing on the roof to watch the city burning, later describing it with the particular composure of someone who had decided that composure was the professional requirement, and that the composure would be genuine, or it would not serve. She had the constitution that wartime entertainment demanded, the capacity to go on while the building shook, and to make the audience glad they had stayed, rather than taken their chances with the streets. In October 1948, Baron Nahum arranged an introduction. Nahum was the society photographer who was among Philip's closest friends and one of the founding members of the Thursday Club that had been meeting in Soho for the previous year. He brought Philip to Kirkwood's dressing room at the London Hippodrome, where she was headlining in the revue Starlight Roof. The introduction was made. The evening that followed extended beyond the theatre, to dinner at Les Ambassadeurs in Mayfair, and then to dancing that, by accounts from people who were present, or who knew the people who were present, continued until dawn. Princess Elizabeth was 8 months pregnant with Prince Charles at the time. Kirkwood and Philip met again, by multiple accounts, on as many as 7 separate occasions in the period that followed. Letters were exchanged. The contact had enough substance and enough documentation that when the story began circulating, it circulated with the persistence of something that could not be dismissed because the specific details could not be disproved. What Kirkwood wanted, for the remaining 59 years of her life, was for Philip to issue a public statement correcting the record. The affair being alleged was one she denied completely and consistently. She needed the denial to come from his direction as well as hers, because the asymmetry of the situation meant that her denial alone carried only the weight that a woman defending herself against a rumor about a prince could carry, which was not much. Philip's denial, added to hers, would have changed the character of the story. He did not provide it. When she wrote to him requesting it, his response was the letter that has been quoted in every subsequent account of the relationship. He wrote that short of starting libel proceedings, there was absolutely nothing to be done. Invasion of privacy, invention, and false quotations were the bane of his existence. This was legally accurate. It was also entirely useless to her. Starting libel proceedings against every newspaper that had printed the story would have created 10 times the publicity of the original rumor, and both of them knew it. He was acknowledging the problem while declining to do anything about it, which was his consistent approach to problems that required him to expose himself in order to solve them. The position left Kirkwood in a specific and extended difficulty. She had not had an affair with Philip. She had had dinner with him and danced with him on one night in 1948. This was a fact. It was the only fact. The story that grew from it attached a significance to that single night that the night did not have, and she spent the rest of her career having to address the question every time a journalist interviewed her, which was often because she was a prominent stage performer, and the question was the one thing every interviewer wanted to ask. What she said, in the statement that has outlasted everything else she said or did, was this: "A lady is not normally expected to defend her honor. It is the gentleman who should do that." She added that she would have had a happier and easier life if Prince Philip, instead of coming uninvited to her dressing room, had gone home to his pregnant wife on the night in question. The word uninvited carries considerable weight in that sentence. It is a specific claim. It was not publicly contested at the time, and has not been publicly contested since. She was not claiming she had been approached inappropriately. She was establishing, for the record, that she had not sought the introduction. The introduction had come to her, and then the consequences of the introduction had stayed with her for decades, while the person who had initiated the introduction stayed silent. She published her memoir in 1999, titled The Time of My Life. The The title operates at several registers simultaneously. She died on Christmas Day 2007, at the age of 86, having received no public support from Philip or from the palace. Philip's answer to journalists who pressed him on the general subject of female companionship was delivered with the rhetorical confidence of someone who had decided that the best defense was to make the questioner feel that they had not thought carefully enough about the question. In 1992, he told a journalist, "Have you ever stopped to think that for the last 40 years, I have never moved anywhere without a policeman accompanying me? So how the hell could I get away with anything like that?" This is an answer that sounds definitive and is technically accurate, and that explains nothing about what may or may not have happened in the years before the police presence became comprehensive. On another occasion he said, "Every time I talk to a woman, they say I have been to bed with her. It is absolutely cuckoo." That answer, too, is technically accurate as a description of the gossip. It does not address the specific documented evenings that generated the gossip. This was Philip's technique throughout his public life. He acknowledged questions by appearing to answer them. The appearance of directness served as a substitute for the content. He was funny and quick, and capable of making people feel that his answer had resolved something, when in fact, the thing that most needed resolving had been left exactly where it was. Kirkwood had 3 marriages across the years, surrounding and following the period when the Philip story was running at its most active. She had married the songwriter and actor Hubert Gregg in 1945, a marriage that lasted 9 years. She then married Spyros Dimitriades, a Greek shipping heir, from 1954 to 1967. She married a third time in 1970, a solicitor named Norman Higgins, who remained her husband until her death. The 3 marriages document a personal life conducted alongside and separately from the professional one, and none of them appear in the biographical accounts of her with the prominence that the Philip connection receives. That imbalance was exactly the imbalance she spent her career trying to correct. Her professional life continued at the level her talent supported. She appeared at the Palladium. She starred in West End productions through the 1950s and 60s. People who saw her perform describe her with the specific enthusiasm reserved for performers who have something beyond craft, a physical authority that rearranges the attention of a room when she enters it, a timing that makes the audience feel that every choice she makes is the inevitable one. Kenneth Tynan's description of her legs as the 8th wonder of the world became the perennial supplement to every piece of coverage she received. The description was evidence of her impact and a reduction of it simultaneously. The kind of notice that tells a performer she has arrived, while also telling her where the walls are. She wrote Philip the letter asking for a public statement in the early 1960s, as nearly as the record can be reconstructed from her memoir and from the accounts of people who knew about the correspondence. His response, quoted in subsequent biographies, was the response about libel proceedings. Short of starting them, there was nothing to be done, she wrote again. The pattern of the correspondence between them, assembled from what appears in The Time of My Life, and in the accounts of people close to both of them, suggests she made the request on more than one occasion across the subsequent years, and that Philip's response, in various formulations, was consistently the same: acknowledgement, no remedy. His reasoning, as stated in the letter, was legally accurate. Starting libel proceedings against newspapers that had printed the rumor would have produced coverage that made the original coverage look modest by comparison. The legal route was a worse option than the situation she was already managing. What Philip did not appear willing to consider was the alternative of a voluntary statement that was not a legal proceeding. He could have said, publicly and clearly, that the evening of October 1948 had been a social occasion, that the relationship had gone no further than a dinner and a night of dancing, and that the story the press had built from it was false. He could have done this. He chose not to. The choice reflected something about Philip's approach to his own exposure that had nothing to do with Kirkwood's interests specifically. He had built a private life alongside his official one, and that construction had value that depended on the palace not being required to comment on specific elements of it. A voluntary public statement about Pat Kirkwood would have been a comment on a specific element. It would have established a precedent for commenting on others. The refusal was not only about Pat Kirkwood, it was about the management system through which the whole arrangement was maintained, and she was, in that system, a necessary cost rather than a primary consideration. She understood this. Her statement about the lady and the gentleman defending the honor is not the statement of a naive woman who did not understand why Philip had declined to help her. It is the precise statement of a woman who understood exactly why, and who was naming the mechanism, because naming it was the only form of accountability available to her from where she stood. The 7 subsequent meetings between them, whose existence Kirkwood described consistently as not constituting an affair, and whose documentation rests primarily on her own account, are the element of the connection that remains most opaque. The character of those meetings is not established in any detailed form. What Kirkwood maintained was that nothing in them constituted what the press implied. Philip's position, as far as it can be read from his documented behavior across the subsequent 5 decades, was to not discuss the meetings at all. She published her memoir in 1999. She was 78. She had been waiting 41 years. The memoir does not read as the work of a bitter woman. It reads as the work of a woman who has decided, after 41 years, that the account belongs in the record, regardless of whether the person who could most usefully have contributed to it ever chooses to. The title, The Time of My Life, operates with the particular irony available to someone who has spent a significant portion of the time of her life managing the consequences of a single night. She died on Christmas Day 2007. Philip was 86. He had been alive for the entire 59 years of her waiting. He would live another 13 years and 4 months after her death, without having addressed the matter publicly. The biographers who have written about this episode describe it consistently as one of the less admirable aspects of Philip's conduct toward the people his private life touched. Whatever happened between them, and whatever the limits of it were, Kirkwood carried the publicly visible cost of it for most of her adult life, and Philip carried none. The distribution of that cost is exactly what her statement about the gentleman defending the lady's honor was naming. The quality of her patience across those 59 years is worth noting separately from the question of whether Philip owed her a resolution, because the patience was its own achievement. She was a working professional. She gave interviews. She spoke publicly about her career across the decades of her later life. She was not the kind of person who avoided public attention or who was unable to manage what public attention brought. She managed the Philip question each time it arose with a consistency that required conscious effort rather than simple silence. Because her position was not the position of someone who could simply refuse to engage. She was asked repeatedly, and she answered repeatedly with the same account. She had not had an affair with Prince Philip. She had had dinner and danced with him on one night in October 1948. She had met him again on subsequent occasions. None of those occasions had gone beyond the limits she described, and she had spent the decades since then waiting for him to provide the public confirmation of her account that would have allowed both of them to move beyond it. The memoir she published in 1999 was not a work of exposure. She named no new details. She did not provide information about the 7 subsequent meetings that would have changed the account she had been giving for 4 decades. She provided the account she had always provided, in a form that placed it on the permanent record, rather than in the ephemeral record of interviews that could be contested or reframed. The Time of My Life was the document she had been waiting 41 years for Philip to help her produce by other means. When it became clear that other means were not going to be provided, she produced it herself. She died 8 years after the memoir appeared. He was alive for every one of those 8 years. He attended no public events in which her name was mentioned. He released no statement in which her account was supported or disputed. He allowed her death to pass in the same silence in which he had allowed her life to pass. From the morning in October 1948, when he left Les Ambassadeurs and walked back into the institutional protection of his position. Her statement remains the last public word on their connection. A lady is not normally expected to defend her honor. It is the gentleman who should do that. She said it. He did not. The Thursday Club was founded in 1947, the same year Philip married Princess Elizabeth, and the coincidence of timing is worth holding in mind. The club was the institution Philip built for the private version of himself in the same years that the public version was being assembled and fitted and walked through its first ceremonial paces. The founders were Baron Nahum, the society photographer, and a group of editors and writers and professional bon vivants who wanted somewhere to eat and drink and say things that could not be said in print. They chose Wheeler's Oyster and Seafood Restaurant at number 19 Old Compton Street in Soho, which at that time was a neighborhood that nobody who had a reputation to protect visited without a compelling reason. Soho in 1947 was prostitutes and drug dealers and jazz clubs, and the kind of cafes where European exiles argued about politics in 4 languages, and the police appeared occasionally and left without making arrests. Bernard Walsh, Wheeler's owner, gave the members an upstairs room that kept their proceedings away from the general clientele. The membership was various, and in retrospect surprising. Baron Nahum was at the center, the person who knew everyone, and who maintained the connections between the worlds that the club was designed to bridge. The actors David Niven and Peter Ustinov were members. James Robertson Justice, who was large and Scottish and had opinions about everything, was a regular presence. Kim Philby, who was at that point still operating as a Soviet intelligence asset, while presenting publicly as a senior British intelligence officer, attended. The Cray twins, London's most feared criminal organisation at the time, appeared from time to time. Philip's cousin David Mountbatten, the third Marquess of Milford Haven, was a member and was the person who brought Philip in. Philip's biographer, Philip Eade, described the Thursday Club gatherings as rip-roaring stag parties. A royal source described the proceedings to The Sun as a gathering of bon viveurs, whose lunches were more notable for the quantity of drink than the quality of the food, and where lunch reliably extended into the evening hours, as wine gave way to port and brandy, and the quality of the proceedings declined at roughly the same rate as the inhibitions of the attendees. A former member recalled that the atmosphere was raffish and mischievous, not deliberately badly behaved, but that things got out of hand regularly once a certain threshold of consumption had been crossed, and that one of the standard conventions of the proceedings was for the person speaking to remove his trousers. The club also had a connection to Stephen Ward, the society osteopath and pimp, who would become the central figure in the Profumo affair in 1963. That connection, which became uncomfortable in retrospect for several former members, was the kind of connection that the social world of Soho in the 1950s made almost inevitable. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone attended the same parties and ate at the same restaurants, and had overlapping circles of acquaintance. The moral geography was mixed in a way that would have been legible to anyone paying attention, and that several former members subsequently preferred not to have paid attention to. What the Thursday Club was, most accurately, was the place where a man who spent his public life walking 2 steps behind his wife could spend his Thursday lunchtimes being the most important person in the room. Philip was not the club's founder, and not formally its center, but his presence transformed its social weight, and everyone present understood this. He was royal, he was funny, he was physically imposing, and he had the particular charm of a man who made people feel that his directness with them was evidence of his respect for them. People found that intoxicating. He found the intoxication useful. The club ran through the 1950s and into the early 1960s, at which point it dissolved by attrition and the accumulation of complications that the Profumo connection made difficult to manage. Mike Parker, Philip's equerry and later private secretary, was the Thursday Club member whose relationship with Philip shaped both men's lives most consequentially, and whose exit from the royal household in 1957 created the most public crisis Philip's personal life had generated since the marriage began. John Michael Avison Parker was born in Melbourne, Australia, on the 23rd of June 1920. He joined the Royal Navy at the outbreak of the Second World War and served in the Battle of Narvik before being assigned to the 27th Destroyer Flotilla in the Far East, where he first met Philip Mountbatten in June 1942. They were separated in age by a year. They served again together in 1944 on sister ships of the same flotilla. When they were on shore leave together in Australia, they discovered that they were both, in their different and similar ways, men who moved fast, talked plainly, laughed easily, and had limited patience for people they found slow or pretentious. Parker attended the wedding at Westminster Abbey in November 1947, and Philip brought him into the household immediately afterward as equerry. By the early 1950s, he was serving as private secretary, managing the logistical and administrative gap between the official Duke of Edinburgh and the man who was unofficially doing everything the Duke was not meant to be seen doing. He was present for the Thursday Club. He was present for the social occasions that the press was not invited to document. He was present in the way that only someone absolutely trusted can be present for the private version of a public person. He was also, from the mid-1950s onward, in a marriage that was deteriorating under the specific and extensive pressures of royal service. His wife, Elén, whom he had married in 1943, found herself in the position that many women married to men who served in the royal household occupied, nominally close to privilege and practically alone for extended periods when the tours were running. She had 2 children, Parker was absent. The absences accumulated. The marriage did not survive them. The crisis arrived in February 1957 and arrived during a royal tour, which was both practically convenient and symbolically damaging. Philip had been on a solo voyage aboard the royal yacht Britannia since October 1956. The tour covered the Antarctic and the Pacific and extended for 4 months, keeping him at sea and away from England for a period that was, even by the standards of Philip's active and externally directed life, unusually long. During this tour, a piece appeared in American newspapers, attributed by biographer Giles Brandreth, in his 2004 book Philip and Elizabeth, Portrait of a Marriage, to the Baltimore Sun, alleging a rift in the royal marriage. Whether the rift was real or a press construction, the timing of the allegation and what happened next created a combination that required careful management. On the 6th of February 1957, while the Britannia was near Gibraltar, Elén Parker's solicitors filed divorce papers in London. The news was published immediately. The press connection between Parker's marital difficulties and Philip's own reputation was made without hesitation, because Parker and Philip had been close for 15 years, and the Thursday Club and its attendant reputation were part of the public record available to every journalist who wanted to use it. Parker resigned from his position as private secretary, describing the decision to his biographers as his own. He left the Britannia at Gibraltar and returned to London, where reporters were waiting. His departure, as the Associated Press reported at the time, rocked palace court circles. The palace issued a statement. The statement read, in its entirety, "It is quite untrue that there is any rift between the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh." That denial, 17 words long, and stated as an absolute, was the most public thing the palace said about Philip's private life, until the question of Penny Natchbull produced a new set of statements several decades later. Elizabeth met Philip in Lisbon in February 1957, boarding Britannia at the Portuguese capital. The reunion was photographed. The couple looked at ease. The optics were managed with the efficiency of an institution that had been managing this specific type of situation, the repair of a public narrative about the stability of the marriage, for some years. Philip was formally designated Prince of the United Kingdom by royal letters patent later that month. The designation addressed the long-standing complaint, one of Philip's genuine grievances, that as the Queen's husband, he held no formal British royal title beyond his dukedom. The timing, 6 days after Elén Parker's divorce papers were filed, was noted by people who paid attention to these things. Parker's exit from the household changed the character of Philip's immediate circle in a specific way. He had been the buffer. He had been the person who managed the gap between the two versions of Philip's life, keeping them from contaminating each other and keeping both available. Once he was gone, Philip needed a different structure. What he assembled over the following decade was a circle without a formal manager, a group of women, and a small number of men who could be trusted to maintain the private version privately, not because they were employed to do so, but because they chose to. The Thursday Club's central figure, at the level of social architecture and connection rather than royal precedence, was Baron Nahum himself. Sterling Henry Nahum was born in Nottingham in 1899 to a family of Sephardic Jewish origin with North African roots and a particular tradition of commercial adaptability. He had trained as a photographer and had made himself, by the mid-1940s, the leading society photographer in Britain, with access to the royal family and to the aristocratic and entertainment worlds that the club was designed to bridge. He had photographed Elizabeth and Philip's engagement and the wedding itself. He photographed the club's members at Wheelers with the casual ease of someone who was simultaneously participant and documentarian. His archive provides some of the most relaxed images of Philip available from the late 1940s and 1950s, images where the official bearing is absent, and what remains is something closer to the young man having a genuinely good time. Nahum's particular service was the introductions. He knew everyone in the social world that overlapped between old money and new celebrity, between the aristocratic and the theatrical, and the professionally accomplished, and he used that knowledge to arrange connections that the official palace social world would not have generated on its own. The introduction to Pat Kirkwood at the Hippodrome in October 1948 was one of those arrangements. There were others across the years of the club's activity that did not generate the same subsequent press attention, but that contributed to the social texture of Philip's life during the period. Nahum died in September 1956, 6 months before the Parker crisis that changed the character of Philip's private circle. His death removed the person who had most effectively managed the social architecture of Philip's non-official life in the post-war years. Without Nahum, the club lost the connective energy that had assembled and sustained it. Without Parker, who resigned the following February, it lost the institutional buffer that had kept the two versions of Philip's life from contaminating each other in front of the press. The twin losses in the space of 6 months reshaped what Philip's private social life looked like in the decade that followed. The Profumo connection that attached to the club's legacy came through Stephen Ward. Ward was a society osteopath who had been, through the late 1940s and the 1950s, a figure in the Soho social world that overlapped significantly with the club's membership. He was connected to the club's social circle rather than to its formal membership. His connection to Christine Keeler and to John Profumo, the war secretary, and to Yevgeny Ivanov, a Soviet naval attaché, constituted the triangle at the center of the scandal that destroyed Profumo and damaged Harold Macmillan's government when it became public in 1963. Ward was tried for living on the earnings of prostitution. He died of a sleeping pill overdose on the last day of his trial, on the 3rd of August 1963, before the verdict was read. Philip was not implicated in the Profumo affair. His connection to Ward was through the social world they had moved through simultaneously, rather than through any direct documented association, and his active attendance at the club had diminished before the Ward connection's most damaging period. The institutional response of the palace was to treat the connection as non-existent, which was the palace's standard approach to connections that did not serve the institutional narrative. Philip's name appeared in no parliamentary inquiry or press investigation of the affair, in any way requiring a formal palace response. Parker's own story after the resignation is worth following briefly, because it illuminates what the private secretary's role had required of him. He returned to London from Gibraltar in February 1957 to find reporters waiting and a narrative already assembled around his departure. He was careful in those interviews, in the way that people who have spent years managing the gap between a public account and a private reality tend to be careful when the gap collapses publicly. He did not provide the press with the version of Philip's life it most wanted. He maintained the same position he had maintained across 10 years of private secretaryship, that Philip had been 100% faithful to the Queen, that the Thursday Club was a male social occasion of the conventional kind, and that the suggestion of anything more was press invention. That position was the last significant service Parker performed for Philip. He held it publicly, under conditions where not holding it would have been considerably easier and more profitable, and he held it for the rest of his life. He moved to Australia and built a career there, in business and broadcasting, lived until the 29th of December 2001, and gave interviews about his years with Philip throughout that later life, without revising the account. Elén Parker, who had filed the divorce papers that ended Parker's palace career, told a somewhat different story in her own memoir, To My Husband with Love, published in 1998. She described a social world more chaotic than Parker's account had suggested, and her marriage's deterioration as connected to the specific demands that royal service had placed on both of them. Her account was contested by Parker, who died 3 years after its publication. Between the two accounts, the texture of what the Thursday Club years had actually looked like from the inside becomes somewhat clearer, and it does not match the benign stag lunch that the male members tended to describe in their public accounts. The women who circulated through Philip's life during the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s cover a range that is easier to understand once you stop trying to find a single explanatory pattern and accept that different women meant different things, and that the connections were not uniform. Merle Oberon was born Estelle Merle O'Brien Thompson in Bombay in 1911, and had, by the time her name appeared alongside Philip's in the gossip columns, reinvented herself so thoroughly as a glamorous Anglo-American film star that the circumstances of her birth had been carefully obscured for decades. The Philip connection, such as it was, appears to have been social rather than sustained, the kind of association that forms when two attractive and prominent people occupy the same international social world, and photographers catch them in proximity. Her biographers have noted the connection without establishing anything beyond social proximity, and it is probably most accurately understood as exactly what the most restrained account of it suggests. Daphne du Maurier was a more interesting case. The woman who had written Rebecca and Jamaica Inn, and who was by the 1950s one of the most successful novelists in the English language, had a private life that was, by the standards of her time and class, unusually complicated. She described herself as having what she called a boyish streak, maintained intense friendships with women throughout her adult life, alongside her marriage to the military commander Frederick Browning, and appears to have found in Philip a companion for the kind of conversation that her public life as a best-selling author and her private life as an aristocratic wife did not easily provide. Her connection to Philip appears to have been genuinely intellectual, based on a shared interest in the questions of character and identity and the relationship between a person's internal experience and the social role they are required to perform. Those were questions both of them had spent considerable time with. Du Maurier died in April 1989, without discussing the connection publicly. Anna Massey was another name that appeared in the gossip, without acquiring substance. She was a distinguished actress with a specific kind of contained intelligence that Philip reportedly found appealing. The connection, if it was more than social acquaintance, left no documented trace. The Countess Bonnie Frescobaldi was Italian, well connected in the European aristocratic world that Philip moved through on the international tours and ceremonial visits of his public life, and was mentioned in the context of the late 1960s and early 70s social world that succeeded the Thursday Club's dissolution. The connection, like several of the others, does not appear in any documented form beyond her name appearing in accounts of his social life from that period. What these connections collectively suggest, and what the pattern of Philip's female friendships over decades makes visible, is a consistent preference for women who were accomplished in their own right, and who did not require his attention to give their lives meaning. Elén Cordet had built a television career that made her a recognizable face in British households. Daphne du Maurier was one of the most commercially successful novelists of her generation. Pat Kirkwood was the biggest female name on the British stage. Sacha Abercorn was running an educational initiative through the Northern Irish Troubles, the kind of work that required genuine conviction and practical organization, rather than aristocratic reputation. Penny Natchbull competed in carriage driving at an international level and had a directness of personality that palace staff found notable. None of them arrived at Philip's side as fans. None of them were waiting for him to appear in their lives and arrange their significance. They were busy people with their own projects and their own reputations, and Philip found that quality interesting in a way that he found the company of people who needed his validation tedious. He had grown up in households where women managed things and made decisions while the men performed. He respected female competence in the way that a person respects something they have depended on for survival. Daphne du Maurier deserves more careful attention than the brief mention she receives in most accounts of Philip's circle, because the connection was genuinely unusual and its character more specific than casual social proximity. Du Maurier had written Rebecca, Jamaica Inn, My Cousin Rachel, and the short stories that Hitchcock had adapted for the screen. She was one of the most commercially successful writers in the English language by the 1950s. She was also a person with an unusually complicated inner life. She described herself as having what she called a boyish streak, a quality her biographers have subsequently examined with the thoroughness available to biographers working after the social constraints that limited her own self-description had relaxed. She maintained intense friendships with women throughout her adult life alongside her marriage to the military commander Frederick Browning, who was Philip's connection to her through the Mountbatten and Royal Military networks that Browning occupied. That connection placed Du Maurier and Philip in the same social world before any personal friendship developed between them. What drew Philip to her company, to the extent that the connection can be reconstructed from indirect evidence, appears to have been a shared preoccupation with the relationship between the person a public role requires you to be and the person you privately are. Du Maurier had explored this territory in her fiction with the consistency of someone working through a question she had a personal stake in. The tension between appearance and reality, between the face presented to the world and the experience behind it, runs through her best work from Rebecca onward, with an urgency that her own inner life explains. Philip was living that tension as a daily operational requirement from the moment Elizabeth became queen in 1952. The theoretical interest in it that his later conversations with Sacha Abercorn would develop in Jungian terms had, in the 1950s, a more practical expression: the actual experience of being required to perform a public persona while conducting a private life that the persona was designed to conceal. Du Maurier, who had thought about this more carefully than most novelists and more honestly than most public figures, was a companion whose understanding of the territory Philip was living in went beyond the social. She died in April 1989. Philip was 67. Her biographers note the connection, without establishing it in documentary form, beyond social proximity and the shared network through Browning. What it was in practice across the years when they moved in overlapping social worlds is another of the private things the circle held without releasing. Lady Penelope Romsey, who later became Penelope Knatchbull as the Countess Mountbatten following Norton's succession to the title, occupied a different position in Philip's world from Penny, despite the subsequent title confusion. Lady Penelope was Norton's younger sister, Philip's goddaughter through his godson's family connection, and present in Philip's social world from her own childhood, rather than through a connection she had formed herself. She was part of the second generation of the same web, the children of the people Philip had chosen becoming people Philip also chose. The circle had that quality of reproduction. It rebuilt itself across generations as the original members aged. Myra Butter, née Myra Alice Wernher, was the daughter of Lady Zia Wernher, and was connected to Philip through the European aristocratic network that also produced Sacha Abercorn's maternal grandmother. She appears in multiple biographies as a consistent presence in Philip's private social world across decades, always at the margin of the documented record rather than its center. Her presence is documented in the way that many of Philip's consistent private social connections are documented, mentioned in sufficient contexts to establish that the presence was real and sustained, but never described in sufficient detail to fully characterize it. The pattern visible across the sustained connections is specific enough to constitute a type. Philip chose women who had earned their own position in the world through work not dependent on his attention or his endorsement, who had a quality of self-sufficiency that made them interesting to him rather than requiring of him, and who had the intellectual or professional or personal substance to maintain an independent presence in a conversation rather than deferring to his. Elén had built herself into a recognizable performer and television presence entirely independent of any royal connection. Pat Kirkwood was the most celebrated female entertainer on the British stage, by her own effort and without institutional support. Du Maurier was one of the most widely read novelists of her generation. Sacha had trained as a Jungian psychologist and had built practical reconciliation programs through a sectarian war. Penny competed internationally in carriage driving and had a directness of personality that palace staff noted as unusual in someone who moved in royal circles. None of them needed him. That quality, the quality of not needing him, appears to have been what kept them in his life. The structural question that follows from this pattern is what it produced in each of the relationships. For Elén, it produced a connection maintained across decades, supported by practical commitments that cost Philip something. For Kirkwood, it produced an encounter that became something more complex than anyone involved had planned, and that she spent 59 years trying to understand in the terms available for it, while Philip spent 59 years declining to provide better ones. For Sacha, it produced a friendship whose intellectual character was documented by both parties, and whose other potential character was addressed only in the careful negative that Sacha provided without being asked. For Penny, it produced something that lasted 30 years and was visible enough to generate its own mythology and its own institutional management problem, while remaining specific enough in its character and context that the people closest to it could describe it, as Pamela Hicks had described the earlier friendships, as based on a shared interest and nothing more. Whether those descriptions are complete is the question that runs through all the accounts. The people who provided them were close enough to be credible and were not necessarily positioned to know everything, and the distinction between a friendship based on a shared interest and a friendship that is also something else is exactly the distinction that the participants in such a friendship are best positioned to understand and least positioned to describe neutrally. Philip's own understanding of those distinctions is not available in any direct documentary form. What is available is a record of his social behavior across the decades, and the record shows a consistent pattern. He sought out people who were accomplished in their own right. He maintained the connections. He did not seek explanations or justifications for maintaining them. He operated from a set of private premises about what his life required and what it was worth having, and he operated from those premises without submitting them to the institutional approval that every other element of his official life was required to obtain. The 1960s were the decade in which this pattern became most visible and least managed. Parker was gone and had taken with him the administrative structure that had organized the private circle's relationship with the official world. Nahum was dead and had taken with him the specific social network of West End introductions and society connections that had shaped Philip's non-official social life in the post-war years. The Thursday Club had dissolved, and with it, the weekly structure of private time that the club had provided. Philip was in his 40s, at the height of his energy, and at the maximum distance from anything resembling the ordinary domestic life of ordinary domestic men. He found the new structure by the method available to someone whose official life already provides an elaborate social calendar. He used the social calendar. Official visits became occasions for private connections. State tours became contexts for renewing relationships that the official itinerary did not schedule. The international aristocratic and celebrity social world that Philip moved through on the official circuit provided, in its margins, the kind of encounters that the Thursday Club had once organized formally. Philip moved through those margins with the specific ease of a man who had been doing this since he was 26, and who had developed, over the intervening years, the particular skill of appearing to be entirely present in the official context, while maintaining the awareness of the private context that ran alongside it. Several of the women who appear in his social life through the 1960s and into the 70s, the Countess Frescobaldi, Anna Massey, the various names that appear in the social journalism of the period, as connected to Philip, in one way or another, appear in a period when the organized infrastructure of his private social life had been replaced by the informal network of individual connections. The informal network was less visible than the Thursday Club had been, which was one of its advantages, and less manageable than the club had been, which was occasionally a disadvantage. The disadvantages showed in the press coverage of that period, which was more intrusive than the press coverage of the Thursday Club years had been, and more sustained in its interest in the specific question of Philip's female friendships. The club had been a visible institution that the press knew about and occasionally commented on, but that provided its own explanatory frame, men lunching, as men of that generation did, at a Soho restaurant, in ways that were slightly disreputable, but not seriously concerning. The post-club social life had no such frame. Philip appeared at social events and talked to women, and was photographed talking to women, and the press interpreted the photographs in the press's way, because the press had no better information. The better information was held by the circle held it. He did not provide the extended self-analytical interviews that biographers prefer, in which the heart's arrangements are laid out for examination. He provided occasional remarks, usually indirect, usually in the context of a larger conversation about something else, and those remarks add up to a picture of a man who was more self-aware than the public persona of blunt directness suggested, and who had thought more carefully than that persona indicated about the specific conditions under which he had arranged his private life. One of those conditions was movement. He had been in motion for virtually his entire adult life, from the naval service in the 1940s, through the endless program of official visits and tours and public functions that defined the consort's calendar. He had learned from childhood that staying in motion was the technique by which difficult things were managed, and the adult version of that technique was the packed schedule, the continuous purposeful activity, the refusal to allow the kind of stillness in which difficult things become undeniable. The private circle existed partly in the spaces between the motion, the Thursday Club's Thursday lunchtimes between official appointments, Baron's Court in the intervals between royal tours, Windsor Horse Show as a fixture in the annual calendar that appeared on the personal schedule before the official one. The women who occupied those spaces were not there as distractions from the motion. They were there as a different kind of company from what the motion provided. People who required genuine engagement rather than ceremonial performance, who could follow where the conversation actually went, rather than where the official context required it to go, and who did not need Philip to be the Duke of Edinburgh in order to find the conversation worth having. Lord Charteris, who knew the interior life of the palace, as well as any person who was not inside the family itself, said in interviews given toward the end of his own life that Philip was the man who held the whole show together. The phrase is interesting because it does not describe what the court circular would describe, Philip as the Duke of Edinburgh, performing the functions of his designated role. It describes Philip as the structural element in the life of the monarch that made the life of the monarch possible. That is a different claim, and a larger one, and it suggests that Charteris's understanding of Philip's contribution to the marriage and to the institution went beyond the ceremonial. What Charteris saw from his position adjacent to both of them across decades was a man who made Elizabeth's work possible, not only by attending the functions and opening the facilities and making the visits that the official role required, but by providing something at the level of the personal that the institution could not provide. He made the private version of the Queen's life functional in a way that the institutional version alone could not have sustained. The private circle was part of that function. Not the only part, and not a part that the official version could acknowledge, but a genuine part. Philip needed the private circle in order to remain the person who could provide what the marriage required of him. The connections maintained with Elén and Pat Kirkwood, and Du Maurier and Sacha, and Penny, were not escapes from the marriage. They were the maintenance of the person inside the marriage, the person that the marriage depended on. This is not an excuse for the cost those connections imposed on the people who held them, particularly Kirkwood. It is an explanation of the structural role they played in a marriage that lasted 73 years, inside an institution that typically consumed the people who lived inside it. The marriage survived. The circle made that survival possible in ways that the official version of the marriage never fully acknowledged, and that the people in the circle understood without needing to have it stated. If you are still with us at this point in the story, leave a comment below and subscribe if you have not already. This channel relies entirely on the people who watch it, and the research that goes into each video takes considerable time and care. Share this video with someone who understands that the official version of royal history is always the starting point, not the whole account. We will continue in a moment. The marriage that Philip conducted alongside all of these friendships was not a simple thing, and was not, despite the best efforts of several decades of official palace communications, a simple love story. Elizabeth and Philip married at Westminster Abbey on the 20th of November, 1947. She was 21, he was 26. The years immediately following the wedding, particularly the period between 1949 and 1951, when Philip was stationed in Malta as a serving Royal Navy commander, and Elizabeth joined him at a rented villa at Guadamanja, were described by those who saw them during that period, and by Elizabeth herself in later recollections, as among the happiest years of her life. They had no full-time household surrounding them, no ceremonial obligations dominating every morning, no round of state visits and official functions that required both of them to perform continuously for an audience. They were, as close as either of them would ever manage, private people. On the 6th of February 1952, Philip was in Kenya with Elizabeth, staying at Treetops Hotel and watching animals at a waterhole. Word arrived in the early hours that King George VI had died during the night at Sandringham. Philip woke Elizabeth and told her. She was queen before dawn. Philip told her later, in the account that appears in biographer Giles Brandreth's work, that the Malta period ended that morning. He never returned to active naval service. He had achieved the rank of commander. The institution absorbed him, and he had no standing to negotiate the terms of the absorption, which was a situation he found genuinely, specifically, constitutionally galling across the 7 decades that followed. He complained about specific aspects of his position, in the specific way that a man with genuine intelligence complains about things he cannot change. He complained that he was the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children. The Windsor name was retained by royal decree over his explicit objection, an objection that was noted, received, and dismissed. A compromise solution, the hyphenated form Mountbatten Windsor, as a surname for descendants without royal titles, was eventually reached years later when both Churchill and Queen Mary were less able to object. Philip's comment on his own position during the years when the Windsor name dispute was unresolved was, by his own account, that he was nothing but a bloody amoeba. The man who had survived a stateless childhood, an absent mother, an absent father, the death of his sister, a world war, and the social ordeal of Gordonston winters, was now required to walk 3 steps behind his wife at formal functions, to bow to her in certain ceremonial contexts, to carry her bouquet when both her hands were occupied, and under no circumstances to give his own name to his own children. The institutional architecture of the consort's role was designed for women whose husbands held the power, and it had been modified only partially for the inverse situation. Philip dealt with it by generating work with the intensity of someone who genuinely needed occupation rather than ceremonial function. He visited factories and opened hospitals and chaired committees and pushed programs and found causes that needed someone to advocate for them with enough energy and stubbornness to actually change things, like the Duke of Edinburgh's award, which was and remains among the most substantive things he built. He also found physical escapes, polo when he was younger, flying, carriage driving in the later decades when the body had formed opinions about falling off horses at speed. These were not hobbies in the decorative sense. They were the contexts where he could have standards, require performance from himself and from those around him, and experience the specific satisfaction of doing a difficult thing correctly. Pamela Hicks addressed the question of how the Queen related to Philip's female friendships in terms that are worth taking seriously because she was in a position to know. She told biographer Sally Bedell Smith that the Queen was very aware that Philip liked to flirt. She said the Queen did not mind. She was explicit that the Queen recognized his friendships for what they were, based on some specific shared interest, not affairs. She knew it was absolutely nothing. Hicks was not a press secretary protecting an institutional narrative. She was a friend and witness of long standing, describing what she had actually observed. Lord Charteris, who as the Queen's private secretary, had the most complete access to the internal life of the palace of anyone not in the family itself, stated there was no evidence of any kind that Philip had strayed. Mike Parker, who had been present for every aspect of Philip's social life for the 10 years of his private secretaryship, said he had been 100% faithful. These three accounts are all in alignment. They are all from credible sources with the access required to know. They do not resolve the question entirely, because the question was never entirely resolvable from the outside, but they establish that the people closest to both the marriage and to Philip's private life had a consistent view. What they do not address, and what no official source has ever quite addressed, is the quality of a marriage that lasted 73 years while containing the kinds of connections this account has been documenting. The Thursday Club and its proceedings, Pat Kirkwood and the 59 Years of Silence, Elén Cordet and the memoir with its central blank, the and also that appeared at the bottom of 30 years of guest lists. These are not nothing, they are the texture of a life conducted partly outside the frame of the marriage, in the social spaces where the institutional performance was not required, and where Philip was allowed to be, for a few hours at a time, precisely as complicated as he actually was. Elizabeth, who had grown up watching the damage that an institution could do to the people inside it, who had spent her entire public life managing the residue of her uncle's abdication, and her sister's unhappiness, and her children's very public marital failures, had made a calculation about Philip early in the marriage, and had sustained that calculation for the rest of her life. The calculation was not naive, it was not denial, it was the considered judgment of an exceptionally perceptive woman who understood that the man she had married was constitutionally incapable of containment, and that the alternatives to accepting him as he was were all worse than the marriage he was offering her. She took the marriage. She looked at him across 7 decades of public appearances with an expression that biographers and photographers and people who watched them at close range described uniformly as genuine. The expression was not performed. It was the face of someone who had chosen and kept choosing and was at peace with the choice. The coronation on the 2nd of June 1953 was the first major public ceremony of the marriage's new configuration, and it established in one extended day what the next 7 decades would look like. Elizabeth was crowned at Westminster Abbey before 2,000 invited guests and a television audience, the BBC estimated at 27 million in Britain alone. Philip knelt before her during the ceremony, placed his hands between hers, and swore to be her liegeman of life and limb. He was the first person to pay homage to the new queen. The symbolism was deliberate, and the gesture was his own. Photographs from the moment of the homage show both of them with the contained expression of people doing something that has genuine weight for them, and that they are not going to make demonstrative. The coronation established the visible form of their public arrangement. Philip walked behind her or beside her, depending on the specific ceremonial requirements of the occasion, and the body language of their public appearances together acquired a shorthand that royal observers and general audiences read as comfortable and consistent. When they were side by side in photographs, they looked like people who were genuinely comfortable in each other's presence. They were. The long solo voyages of the 1950s were a different matter. Philip undertook a series of extended royal tours through that decade and into the early 60s that kept him away from England for periods of months. The tour that extended from October 1956 to February 1957 aboard the royal yacht Britannia through the Antarctic and the Pacific was the longest, 4 months at sea. The tour was official and its purposes were institutional, representing the Crown in Commonwealth territories. The private consequences were something the palace managed, with the reflex of an institution that had been managing narratives about the royal family for centuries. The Baltimore Sun article that appeared during this tour, alleging a rift in the royal marriage, required a response. Whether there was a rift in the practical sense is a question the people closest to the marriage answered consistently. Parker, who was aboard the Britannia for most of the voyage, said there was no rift. Charteris, with access to the Queen's concerns and to the broader palace assessment of the marriage's condition, said there was no evidence of a rift of any kind. The palace's own statement, issued in February 1957, when the press attention required something official, read, "It is quite untrue that there is any rift between the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh." Elizabeth flew to Lisbon in February 1957 and joined Philip on the Britannia at the Portuguese capital. The reunion was photographed. They looked at ease. The press accepted the photographs as evidence of the condition they were meant to document, because the alternative, continuing the rift story without any evidence that the rift was real, required a commitment to speculation that even the most aggressive newspapers could not sustain against the visual evidence of a couple who appeared glad to see each other. Philip was formally designated Prince of the United Kingdom by royal letters patent on the 22nd of February 1957, 6 days after Eileen Parker's divorce papers were filed. The timing of the designation, which addressed his long-standing formal grievance about holding no British royal title beyond his dukedom, was noted by people who paid attention to the palace's management techniques. Giving Philip something he had wanted in the week immediately following the Parker crisis was not a coincidence of administrative convenience. It was the palace demonstrating, to Philip and to the press simultaneously, that the marriage was stable and the institutional relationship between husband and wife was functional enough that the Queen would take action on his behalf at precisely the moment when the action would be most clearly read as a vote of confidence. The marriage's interior, as opposed to its public surface, was something that the people who observed it from close range described with striking consistency across a range of independent accounts. They described a couple who argued Philip's temper was real and was not managed behind closed doors in any significantly different way from the way it was occasionally managed in public, which is to say that it was not managed very carefully. Elizabeth's response was the response of someone who had grown up in a household where strong personalities were managed by not accommodating the temper while also not making it a subject of formal discussion. She waited it out. He arrived on the other side of it. They resumed. They had a private language together that long marriages produce, the accumulated shorthand of two people who have been managing the same domestic territory for decades and who have developed efficient codes for communicating about it. The specific content of that private language is not documented, because the people who witnessed it occasionally understood only that it was happening rather than what it was saying. What is documented is that it existed, and that it made observers feel the connection between the two of them was specific rather than generic, particular rather than performed. Elizabeth's understanding of Philip's female friendships, as Pamela Hicks described it, was not the understanding of a wife who had decided to accept something she could not change. It was the understanding of a woman who had looked at her husband with accurate eyes across decades and had reached a conclusion about the character of what she saw. The conclusion was, this is who he is. The friendships were based on specific shared interests and were not substitutes for the marriage or threats to it. She knew it was absolutely nothing. Whether absolutely nothing is a complete description of what the friendships were, is the question that the friends themselves have answered in the careful ways documented elsewhere in this account. But Elizabeth's understanding of them, the understanding of the person who was married to Philip for 73 years, and who knew him at a level of proximity that no biographer or journalist can replicate, was that the friendships were what they appeared to be. Connections maintained with the consistency that was Philip's characteristic mode of operating, and not substitutes for the marriage. The children were a separate and more difficult dimension of the marriage's interior. Philip's approach to his eldest son Charles has been documented extensively in Charles's own accounts and in the biographies of both father and son, and the documentation is not flattering to Philip. He had received Gordonstoun's philosophy of character formation through hardship as liberation, because for Philip, who had been managing hardship without institutional support since childhood, the school's austerity was a familiar environment made better by structure. He applied the same philosophy to Charles, who was a different child in a different position, who had not developed the protective self-sufficiency that Philip had built from necessity, and who received Gordonstoun's rigor as abandonment rather than education. The distance between father and son that this produced was one of the genuine failures of Philip's private life. He recognized it later, in the indirect way that Philip acknowledged difficult things, through the medium of other people's accounts of conversations in which he had said something that acknowledged the problem, without quite constituting an apology. The recognition did not fully repair the distance. Some distances, assembled across a childhood, are not fully repairable in adult life. Philip's relationship with Anne was warmer, a fact that biographers attribute in part to Anne's inheriting more of her father's temperament, and in part to Philip's greater comfort with a child whose response to difficulty resembled his own. His relationship with Andrew and Edward was shaped by the same temperamental gaps that the age difference between Philip's own early life and the protected early lives of his youngest children had always made difficult to bridge. Elizabeth managed all of these dimensions with the precision that she had developed for managing all of the things in her marriage that could not be changed and could only be worked around. She had the capacity that long-experienced parents develop, the ability to hold the family as a whole while accommodating the specific needs and injuries of its individual members, without losing sight of what the family needed to continue to be. Alexandra Anastasia Hamilton, Duchess of Abercorn, known throughout her life as Sasha, was born in Tucson, Arizona, on the 27th of February 1946. The Arizona birth was incidental to her identity, a consequence of her family staying in the United States while her father recovered from tuberculosis. She was not American in any way that shaped her. She was English in ways that went very deep, and European in ways that went deeper still. Her ancestry ran through virtually every significant royal house on the European continent. Through her maternal grandmother, Lady Zia Wernher, she was related to the Tsars of Russia, and, through the Russian imperial connection, to the poet Alexander Pushkin, whose legacy she promoted actively throughout her adult life. Via Sophia of Hanover, she was a direct descendant of King James VI of Scotland and I of England. She described herself as having a very eclectic mix of blood, which, like a chameleon, helps you to fit in anywhere. Her godfather was Lord Louis Mountbatten, Earl Mountbatten of Burma. This connection placed her within the same web of relationships that had surrounded Philip's entire adult life. The Mountbatten connection was not merely genealogical. Mountbatten had been the architect of Philip's introduction to British royal life, the person who had managed the match with Princess Elizabeth, who had navigated Philip's naturalization and his transformation from displaced Greek prince to eligible royal husband. To have Mountbatten as your godfather was to stand very close to the center of the story that Philip had been living since 1947. When Sasha married James Hamilton, the 5th Duke of Abercorn, in 1966, she moved to Baronscourt, the Hamilton family estate near Newtown Stewart, in County Tyrone, in Northern Ireland. The house stood in the west of Ulster, as the Troubles were forming and then breaking over the communities around it. Rather than retreating into the insulation that aristocratic life and a grand estate might have provided, Sasha became engaged with the society she was living in. She trained as a Jungian psychologist. She developed educational initiatives designed to bring Catholic and Protestant children into shared learning environments, the kind of practical, sustained, years-long work that required conviction rather than charity. She described her approach to the communities around her as coming from the same place as her psychological training, an interest in what happened to people when they were forced to hold their identity under pressure. Philip came to Baronscourt for the carriage driving that the estate's grounds accommodated, and for the conversations that Baronscourt facilitated. His interest in Carl Jung was genuine and had been developing since the 1960s. Jung's analytical framework, which placed the tension between the persona a person presents to the world and the shadow self that the persona conceals at the center of psychological experience, had an obvious resonance for a man who had been performing a specific public identity since 1952, while maintaining a private self that required different kinds of space and different kinds of company. Philip was not a man who would have articulated it in those terms. He was not given to the language of self-examination in its therapeutic forms, but he was a man who had spent 40 years managing the gap between what he was officially and what he actually was, and he recognized in Jung's framework a description of the problem he had been living with. Sasha understood that framework from the inside, through her training and through the application of it to the communities around her in Northern Ireland. She could talk about it with the specificity of someone who had used it as a practical tool rather than an intellectual system. Philip found that valuable in a way that most of his official social world could not replicate. The connection between them was visible enough that it generated the kind of gossip that surrounds any sustained friendship between a prominent married man and a prominent woman who is not his wife. The gossip circulated in the same channels that the other names had circulated through, the polite social networks where information moved as implication rather than accusation, the places where eyebrows did the work that words were not supposed to do. Sasha addressed it directly, and the directness of her address is part of what makes her account worth quoting in full. She told the biographer Giles Brandreth, in a conversation that appeared in the Daily Telegraph's obituary of her when she died in December 2018, that her relationship with Philip had been a passionate friendship. She then added, without being asked to add it, that the passion was in the ideas. She said it was certainly not a full relationship. She said she had not gone to bed with him. That statement has 4 components, and each component does specific work. The passionate friendship acknowledges that the connection was real and had intensity. The qualification that the passion was in the ideas specifies what kind of intensity. The phrase, certainly not a full relationship, establishes a boundary that the phrasing would not have required if the relationship had never been the kind of thing that the word full would distinguish it from. And the final statement, I did not go to bed with him, is the sentence that would not have been necessary if the question had never been raised. Sasha was a psychologist who used language carefully. She was describing a connection that had been more than casual, that she clearly valued, and that she was correcting in the specific direction that needed correction. She died on the 10th of December 2018, at the age of 72. Philip, who was 97 and no longer attending public events, sent a message. Sasha had spent the years before Philip's death building something at Baronscourt that most people in her position would not have attempted. The Hamilton family estate in County Tyrone sat in the middle of one of the most contested territories in the United Kingdom during the worst years of the Troubles. Baronscourt was not insulated from the surrounding conflict in the way that a large estate in a peaceful county would be. It was in it. The communities around the estate had been living in proximity to violence for years by the time Sasha decided that reconciliation could be done practically rather than simply proclaimed. She developed educational programs that brought Catholic and Protestant children into shared learning environments, the kind of sustained, years-long work that required genuine commitment rather than charitable gesture. The programs ran through periods when the communities they were designed to serve were not able to speak to each other without intermediaries, and Sasha functioned as an intermediary who had credibility in both directions. The Duchess of Abercorn, with all the Protestant aristocratic associations that title carried in Ulster, and also a trained Jungian psychologist who had spent years thinking about why people told they were different from each other, had more in common than the categories suggested. Her interest in Carl Jung was not an intellectual hobby. She had trained formally and applied the training to practical problems, and her interest in the framework Jung had developed for understanding the relationship between the persona people present to the world and the shadow self that the persona contains was rooted in professional use rather than fashionable theory. Philip had arrived at Jung through a different route. His reading in the 1960s had extended into psychology and philosophy, without being guided by any institutional framework or academic requirement. He had the autodidact's tendency to pursue an interest wherever it led, without needing to justify the pursuit. He pursued several of them into territory that the official version of his public persona did not publicize. He read widely in the philosophy of science during the 1960s, and maintained an engagement with questions of environmental science that went beyond the ceremonial patronage he extended to the World Wildlife Fund. He had conversations with scientists and ecologists that biographers who examined the correspondence and the accounts of participants described as genuinely substantive rather than the politely interested conversations that his official position technically required. He was interested in painting and pursued it seriously enough to produce work that was shown publicly and evaluated by critics who were not predisposed to generosity toward a royal amateur. He was interested in the carriage driving not only as a competitive activity, but as a technical discipline with its own body of knowledge and its own history, and he studied both with the thoroughness he brought to everything he chose to take seriously. He wrote a book about carriage driving, competition carriage driving, published in 1982, that was received as a serious contribution to the sport's technical literature rather than as a ceremonial royal publication. The autodidact's projects accumulate without an institutional framework to organize them, which means they accumulate according to the internal logic of the autodidact's own interests, rather than the external logic of a curriculum or a career. Philip's interests accumulated around the questions of what a self is under institutional pressure, how a natural world functions, and what human activity does to it, and how technical and physical disciplines work at the level of their specific demands, rather than their social presentation. These were not random interests. They were the interests of a man who was managing a specific set of problems in his own life, and who sought intellectual company and intellectual tools that helped him manage those problems more clearly. The circle provided several of those tools. Sacha provided the Jungian framework. Du Maurier provided the literary articulation of the persona problem. The scientists and conservationists he worked with on the environmental issues provided the empirical discipline that balanced the psychological theorizing. Penny provided something more direct, the company of someone who engaged with the physical world on its own terms, who competed rather than observed, who understood what it meant to be evaluated on whether you had done a difficult thing correctly, rather than on whether you had performed the role assigned to you appropriately. Jung had led him toward a description of something he had been living for 20 years by the time he began applying the description. The specific experience of being required to perform a designated social identity while maintaining a private self that the designated identity could not fully accommodate. The conversations at Barons Court, which multiple biographers note without being able to quote directly, were conversations between two people who had a shared technical language for a shared problem, and who were capable of being specific about it in ways that most of Philip's official social world could not accommodate. Philip was not someone who wanted therapeutic disclosure. He was someone who wanted to understand something, and understanding something requires a companion who has the same interest in understanding it that you do. Sacha had that interest, and she had it for reasons that went beyond the intellectual. She had been applying the Jung framework in County Tyrone for years, in conditions where the understanding had practical consequences rather than merely personal ones. She could give back rather than simply receive, and the giving back was in a currency Philip valued, which was precision and substance. Barons Court had provided, across the years of his visits, one of the few spaces where the two versions of Philip's life could be present simultaneously, without needing to be separated. He was there as the Duke of Edinburgh, which he was. He was also there as a person who was interested in what Sacha was thinking, and what her work had found, and what the Jung framework explained that the week's events at the palace did not, which he also was. The two versions did not conflict in that setting. They were, at Barons Court, the same person. That was the rarest thing that any of the relationships in his circle provided, and the reason its provision mattered is that it was rarely available anywhere else. Philip had, by the time the Barons Court friendship was at its most active in the 1980s and early 90s, been performing the Duke of Edinburgh for 30-plus years. The performance was not a fraud. It was the expression of things he genuinely was: the impatience, the directness, the physical energy, the contempt for pretension. But the performance was also not the whole of what he was, and the things it did not express had been accumulating for 3 decades by the time Sacha was in a position to receive them. The Jung framework gave those things a language. Philip had spent 30 years experiencing the gap between the persona and the shadow, the public face and the private self, as a practical reality, without a vocabulary precise enough to describe it. Sacha provided the vocabulary, not in the therapeutic sense of inviting disclosure, but in the intellectual sense of offering a framework that could articulate what he had been living. The difference between those two things was important to Philip. He was a man who found therapeutic disclosure uncomfortable, and who found precise intellectual articulation valuable. Sacha gave him the latter. What the conversations at Barons Court produced in Philip's own thinking appears in the oblique ways that his conversations with biographers in the late years of his life addressed questions about identity and role, and the relationship between what a person is required to be and what they actually are. He did not use Jungian terminology. He would not have wanted to. But the questions he engaged with when biographers gave him the space to engage with them were the questions that the Jungian framework addresses, and the fact that he was still engaging with them in his 80s and 90s suggests that the engagement had been sustained over a long period, rather than being a late-life discovery. Sacha died in December 2018. She was 72. Philip was 97. The conversations at Barons Court had been running for over 30 years. Philip sent a message in response to the news, documented by people close to both of them, without the message's content being made public. The gesture was what Philip's gestures always were, the minimum public expression required, and not a word beyond it. The internal weight of the gesture is not available to the public record. She had been the person who could give back to him in the specific currency of intellectual precision, rather than simply receiving what he offered. The people who can give back rather than simply receive are the rarest people in any life, and particularly in the life of someone whose position means that receiving is the default mode of every interaction. Philip had built a circle that contained several of them. He had known, in finding each of them, what he was looking for. He had recognized what he found. Penelope Meredith Mary Eastwood was born on the 16th of April 1953 in England. Her father, Reginald Eastwood, was a butcher who had built the Angus Steakhouse restaurant chain into a successful business. This was not the background that most members of the extended royal social world had come from, and by multiple accounts, Penny carried that background without self-consciousness, which was one of the things people who knew her consistently noted about her. She was not defined by her proximity to titles, not because she was unaware of them, but because she had developed her own sense of who she was before the titles became her permanent context. She was educated in Switzerland and graduated from the London School of Economics in 1976. Friends described her as outgoing, well-read, and possessed of what several sources called a boisterous sense of humor. That phrase, appearing in multiple independent accounts of her personality, points towards something specific. Philip's humor was pointed. It was the humor of a man who had learned early that the ability to make people laugh was a survival tool, and who used it to test whether the people around him could hold their own in his atmosphere without flinching. A person with a boisterous sense of humor, rather than a careful one, was a person Philip could be himself with, rather than performing for. She entered the royal circle through Norton Natchbull, who had attended Gordonston with Prince Charles. Around 1974 or 1975, while she was dating Norton, she was introduced to Philip and the Queen at a polo match. An insider recalled her in conversation with biographer Ingrid Seward as one of the most natural young women I have ever met. Outgoing, but not brash or flirty. Both Philip and the Queen were reportedly impressed, which is not a common observation in the accounts of people being introduced to them for the first time. Norton Natchbull's identity was inseparable from his grandfather. He was Louis Mountbatten's grandson. He was Philip's godson. He had the Mountbatten name, and the Mountbatten history, and the Mountbatten estate in his future. When Penny married into that family, she did not merely marry a man. She married into the structure of relationships and memories and losses and loyalties that had surrounded Philip since before his marriage to Elizabeth. Through Norton, she was connected to the center of Philip's emotional history in a way that no formally designated member of the court could have been. The wedding took place on the 20th of October 1979 at Romsey Abbey in Hampshire. Charles served as best man. The ceremony came 2 months after the bomb at Mullimore. On the 27th of August 1979, an IRA bomb destroyed Lord Mountbatten's fishing boat, Shadow V, in the harbour at Mullimore in County Sligo. Mountbatten was killed. So was his 14-year-old grandson Nicholas Natchbull, Norton's younger brother. A local teenage boat boy named Paul Maxwell, who was 15, also died. The Dowager Lady Brabourne was mortally wounded and died the following day. Norton Natchbull, Philip's godson, was injured and survived. For Philip, who was 58 at the time, Mountbatten's death removed the only person who had functioned consistently and across decades as a parent. Mountbatten had managed Philip's marriage into the monarchy. He had navigated the name dispute and the title dispute, and all the other disputes that arose from the collision between Philip's displacement and the institution's requirements. He had been the person who knew the whole story, who had been present for it from the beginning, and who could be relied upon to understand Philip's frustrations with a precision that nobody else in his life, not Elizabeth, not the household staff, not his children, quite matched. His death at 79 on a boat in Irish coastal waters left a gap that the institution could not fill and that Philip, characteristically, did not describe publicly. The Natchbull wedding 2 months later was attended by the royal family in the specific context of people who had gathered together in the aftermath of that gap and were attempting to go forward. Penny married into a family still marked by the loss. Philip attended a wedding that connected him, through his godson, to the family whose center had just been destroyed. Their friendship, the one that would eventually acquire the nickname "and also," and the palette of tabloid photographs, and the 30-year calendar of appearances that the press documented without quite understanding, did not begin there. It began later, in the context of a different loss. The Natchbulls had 3 children, Nicholas, Alexandra, and Leonora Louise Marie Elizabeth Natchbull, born on the 25th of June 1986. When Leonora was around 4 years old, she was diagnosed with kidney cancer. The treatment lasted 14 months. On the 22nd of October 1991, she died in a London hospital. She was 5 years old. Philip had learned grief from a specific kind of school. His mother had been taken from him when he was 9. He had stood behind his sister's coffin at 16. He had told a biographer, in a sentence that has been quoted repeatedly because it does a great deal of work in a small space, "The family broke up. My mother was ill. My sisters were married. My father was in the south of France. I just had to get on with it." You do, one does. The sentence is stoic to the point of clinical. It is also honest in a way that the stoicism does not disguise. One does get on with it. Philip had been getting on with it since he was 9 years old, and the getting on had been achieved by the specific technique of staying in motion and keeping the emotional machinery running, and not sitting still with the things that had cost him. He understood, when Leonora died, what that cost looked like in another person. He understood it not as a concept or as a polite social response to grief, but as a physical familiarity. He had been in the position Penny was in, or versions of it, since childhood. He knew what it was to have the household structure collapse in a way that left you with no choice but to reassemble yourself around the absence. He showed up. Not publicly, not with the gestural sympathy of flowers and correct letters. He showed up as a private presence, repeatedly, in the period after Leonora's death when most people had returned to their own lives. Ingrid Seward, in Prince Philip Revealed, recorded that he befriended Penny when her life began to fall apart following the death, that he encouraged her to take up carriage driving, and that he supported her when her husband Norton left her in 2010 for another woman. He enlisted his head groom, Mickey Flynn, to begin teaching her carriage driving. By 1994, Philip was teaching her himself. The shared activity gave the friendship a structure and a visible context, and a reason to be seen together at events without requiring explanation. The activity was real. She learned it properly. She competed at an international level. She was not a passenger in Philip's carriage driving world. She was a participant in it. Palace staff settled on Andan, and also because the pattern was so consistent that it had acquired the grammar of inevitability. Every guest list, every occasion, the names, and then at the bottom, and also Penny. Over 30 years, she appeared at the Royal Windsor Horse Show, at Sandringham, at Cows Week, at the carriage driving events and private gatherings that constituted the social geography of Philip's later life. The tabloids began documenting the friendship in the mid-1990s with the sustained attention they brought to anything involving the royal family that could not be classified as official. The photographs accumulated. The proximity was noted. The regularity was analyzed by royal commentators who tried to place it in the familiar categories of the court and found that it did not quite fit any of them. Norton Natchbull's departure from the marriage in 2010, when Philip was 89, did not end Penny's place in his world. Philip continued the friendship with his godson's estranged wife, as if the institutional complication did not change the personal reality, which was his consistent approach to personal realities that did not have institutional solutions. The palace said almost nothing across all of those years. The silence was the standard response. When you deny too specifically, you confirm the significance of what you are denying. When you say nothing, you leave space for people to believe what they want, which is sometimes more dangerous and sometimes more useful than a statement. The palace chose the silence, repeatedly, and the silence served as a kind of protection, even as it generated its own ambiguity. In April 2021, Philip died, and Penny came to Windsor for the funeral. The palace explained her presence as her husband's representative. Royal observers said the framing was inadequate. She sat in the chapel with 30 people. She had turned 68 the day before. An aide told reporters she looked heartbroken. She has lost her best friend. The 30 years of Penny's sustained presence in Philip's social world can be read in the photographic record, which is unusually extensive because the occasions where they appeared together were public events with press access. The Royal Windsor Horse Show, which runs every May at Windsor Castle, and which was the central fixture of Philip's carriage driving calendar from the mid-1980s onward, accumulated over the years a photographic archive of Philip and Penny in proximity, that royal observers treated as evidence of exactly what it looked like. Two people extremely comfortable with each other, consistently in the same place. The tabloids began documenting the friendship with sustained attention in the mid-1990s, during the period when the marriages of three of Elizabeth's four children had collapsed in succession, and the press appetite for anything connected to royal private life had reached a peak that the coverage of Charles and Diana's separation had accelerated rather than satisfied. Penny and Philip appeared at events together in this period, with a regularity the press could not ignore, and the interpretation placed on the regularity was the interpretation the press placed on any sustained proximity between a married royal and a woman who was not his wife. The photographs ran with captions implying what the newspapers were not willing to say as statements of fact. The palace's response was the response it had applied to Philip's private social life since the Parker crisis in 1957. Silence, and technically accurate, but inadequate statements when silence was not available. When journalists asked directly about Penny's relationship with Philip, palace representatives confirmed that she was a family friend of long standing, with connections through the Mountbatten family and through her husband Norton. The statement was accurate as far as it went. It described a fraction of what was true. Norton Natchbull's role in the relationship during the period when the friendship was attracting the most attention was that of the person whose institutional connection to Philip explained Penny's presence without the explanation being adequate. He was Philip's godson. She was his wife. This placed her in Philip's social world through a recognized familial mechanism, and the palace used that mechanism as the public frame for a connection that had long since developed its own character, independent of the mechanism that had initially enabled it. Norton left the marriage in 2010. He met Caroline MacLeod, whom he would eventually marry. Philip was 89 when Norton's departure from the marriage became known. The institutional complication of the situation, his godson's estranged wife remaining in his social world, appears to have produced no change in the practical reality of Penny's position in that world. Philip appeared. She continued to arrive at Sandringham and Windsor for the occasions where the "and also" addition to the guest list specified her presence. The "and also" continued. What this continuation meant about Philip's understanding of the relationship is the kind of thing that the people who knew him well tend to avoid specifying. What it demonstrated to observers was that Philip made the private reality of a connection the basis of his conduct, rather than the institutional tidiness of the connection's official status. Norton's departure made the official frame more complicated to maintain. Philip maintained it anyway. The carriage-driving world gave the friendship a structure and a public context the palace could point to as explanation for the sustained proximity. Philip had begun competing seriously in four-in-hand carriage driving in the early 1980s after a polo injury made continuing to ride at the level he had been riding at impractical. He had approached carriage driving with the same competitive seriousness he had brought to polo, studying the technique, working with expert horsemen, competing at national and then international level, and insisting on the standards of performance the discipline required. He was not an enthusiastic amateur. He was a serious competitor who happened to be 60 years old when he took up the sport, and who was competing internationally by his mid-60s. He taught Penny, through his head groom Mickey Flynn initially, and then himself directly. By the early 1990s, she was competing in her own right. By the mid-90s, she was competing at an international level that did not reflect anything about her proximity to Philip, beyond the fact that he had introduced her to the sport and that she had chosen to take the introduction seriously. She was not a passenger in his competitive world. She was a participant who had developed genuine expertise. The shared discipline gave their appearances at carriage driving events a frame that made the press photographs easier to caption accurately. They were at the Royal Windsor Horse Show because they were both serious carriage driving competitors. They were at Sandringham for the events because both of them participated in the circuits those events were part of. The explanation was true. It was also incomplete in the way that all the explanations the palace and the people close to Philip provided for his sustained connection to Penny were incomplete. Over 3 decades, Philip's household staff had settled on the "and also" designation, not to describe an occasional guest, but to describe a constant in Philip's social calendar. The "and also" appeared at events that were not carriage-driving events, at occasions where the frame of a shared sport did not apply. It appeared at gatherings private enough to not have press coverage, and that therefore appear in the record only through the recollections of people who were present. It appeared consistently enough that palace staff had given it a specific name, which is what happens when a pattern has become as reliable as the furniture. Philip's deteriorating health in the final years of his public life. The hip replacement in December 2019, the period of hospitalization for a pre-existing heart condition in February 2021, the death in April of that same year, was the period in which Penny's presence became both more visible to the outside world and more clearly a matter of personal rather than institutional gravity. She appeared at Windsor in the weeks before he died, by accounts from people close to both of them. She was present in the period when the small group of household staff and family that had gathered around him in his final weeks constituted the last version of the circle that had kept his private world intact for so long. The birthday coincidence, that she turned 68 on the 16th of April and his funeral was on the 17th, is the kind of detail that makes the event feel shaped in the way that long-sustained relationships have their endings, not the clean conclusion that official narratives produce, but something more weighted and more specific, and more impossible to account for adequately with the language available for it. She came to Windsor the morning after her birthday. The palace said she was there as Norton's representative, 11 years after Norton had left the marriage. The adequacy of that framing was noted by several commentators in print. The palace did not revise it. What the palace chose not to revise, across 30 years of managing the question of Penny's relationship with Philip, was the fundamental frame that her presence in his social world was explained by her marriage to his godson, by her connection through the Mountbatten family, by the shared interest in carriage driving, and by the kind of sustained family friendship that develops naturally across decades in the social world the royal family occupies. Each component of that frame was accurate. None of it was sufficient. The insufficiency was apparent to anyone who looked carefully at the pattern of her appearances, and also consistency. The regularity that palace staff had given a nickname because the regularity was too reliable to require continued explanation. The nickname was accurate where the official frame was not. And also Penny meant, she will be here again. It was not a joke or an observation. It was a description of a fact that had become as fixed as the calendar fixtures around it. Philip appears to have understood, at some level, what the sustained visibility of Penny's presence in his life meant for her reputation and for the questions it generated. He appears not to have changed it. The consistency with which he continued to arrange for her presence, even as the press attention made the management more complicated, and even as Norton's departure from the marriage made the official explanation more difficult to maintain with a straight face, suggests that the value of the connection to him was sufficient to outweigh the complications it generated. This is one of the places where the parallel with Pat Kirkwood is instructive and also incomplete. Kirkwood's situation had been costly to her because the cost had been imposed without her consent, through the mechanism of a rumor she did not generate and had no power to stop. Penny's situation was different. She had chosen to maintain the connection, had chosen to continue appearing at the events that generated the press attention, had chosen not to give the kind of interviews that would have changed the terms of the public discussion. Her silence, unlike Kirkwood's, was fully voluntary. What it expressed, that voluntary silence across 30 years, is the same thing that all the voluntary silences in Philip's circle expressed. The judgment that the connection was worth protecting, and that the protection was the right thing to do, and that the right thing to do was worth the cost of doing it. After Philip died, Penny largely withdrew from the public events that had generated the photographic archive of their 30-year friendship. She appeared at the memorial service in March 2022 that gathered the full number of mourners that the pandemic restrictions had excluded from the April 2021 funeral. She was present in the section of the congregation where people who had been close to Philip in the private dimensions of his life were placed. She was photographed. She did not speak to the press. The public record of the friendship, which had accumulated across 30 years of horse shows and garden parties, and carriage driving events and private occasions documented by the household accounts that biographers eventually consult, did not expand after his death. She held the end of the arrangement that she had agreed to hold, and she has continued to hold it. The aide's phrase, best friend, is the most accurate description of the connection that the public record contains. It is also the most accurate description that the public record is likely to obtain. The palace will not add to it. Penny will not add to it. Natchbull is unlikely to add to it. The people who were present at the private occasions where the friendship was most fully itself are the people who have kept the arrangement intact for 3 decades, and there is no reason in the public record to expect that the arrangement will be broken posthumously. Philip held his end until he died. His circle is holding theirs. What the circle around Philip, taken as a whole, witnessed across the better part of 6 decades, was a man who organized his emotional life outside the frame that the official version of his position provided, and who was disciplined enough about that organization to leave very little of it on the public record. The record that exists is made of specific things: photographs at horse shows, guest lists with consistent additions, school fee receipts, published memoirs with absences at their centers. It is made of Pat Kirkwood's statement about defending her honor and the silence that met it for 59 years. It is made of Elén Cordet's memoir and the question she left blank. It is made of Sacha Abercorn's careful precision and what the precision implies about the question she was answering. It is made of Penny Natchbull's sustained presence over 3 decades and the nickname that palace staff gave her because the pattern had become as reliable as the rest of the palace calendar. Ingrid Seward, who knew Philip personally and who wrote the most current comprehensive biographical account of his life, Prince Philip Revealed, published in 2020, described him as someone who could be rude and who walked away from conversations midway through them and who did not extend patience to people he found stupid. She also described him as a man of genuine intellectual restlessness, who found the ceremonial obligations of his position constitutionally galling, and who conducted his emotional life in the spaces between the public duties. That description, taken as a whole, is accurate to the man as the record shows him: too self-possessed to be fully transparent, too intelligent to be entirely hidden. Parker and Charteris and Hicks said he was faithful, their accounts align, their access was real, and their proximity to the marriage over decades gives their testimony weight. Kirkwood spent 59 years waiting, and died waiting. Elén left the central question of her memoir blank. Sacha specified, without being asked to specify, that she had not gone to bed with him. These facts also exist, and they do not disappear because the first set of testimony is credible. What the 2 sets of evidence together suggest is not that one is true and the other is false, but that both describe the same complicated man from different angles. The man who was 100% faithful to his wife, as Parker described him. The man who came uninvited to a dressing room and did not go home to his pregnant wife, as Kirkwood described him. The man whose friendship with Sacha Abercorn was passionate enough that she felt the need to clarify its limits. The man who put "and also Penny" at the bottom of 30 years of guest lists. These descriptions belong to the same person. The difficulty is that they are hard to hold together in the way that official stories prefer things to be held together, which is neatly. Philip died on the 9th of April 2021, at Windsor Castle, in his sleep, at the age of 99. He had been in declining health for some months. The official cause of death was old age. The palace issued a statement. The world responded in the way it responds when a figure who has been present for the entirety of living memory is suddenly absent, with a mixture of genuine grief and the specific disorientation that comes with the removal of something permanent. The Queen sat alone in her pew at the funeral, 11 feet of empty bench on either side of her, masked in black. The photograph ran on the front page of every newspaper in the English-speaking world. She had been married to him for 73 years, 4 months, and 28 days. She had loved him since she was 13 years old, and had never loved anyone else. The orange crate that had carried him out of Corfu in December 1922, or the image of the orange crate that the family story preserved, whether or not the exact detail is literally true, carried forward in it something that the Corfu summer of 1921 had produced, and that the palace and the institution and the ceremonial obligations and the long walk, 2 steps behind, could arrange but could never quite contain. The man was more than the position. The person who emerged from that particular childhood, with those particular losses and that particular training in how to keep moving, was not a person who could be fitted cleanly into an official version without leaving things out. The things that were left out are what his circle knew, the circle that sat with him at Wheeler's, and the circle that heard him in dressing rooms, and the circle that met him at Baronscourt for conversations about Jung, and the circle that drove carriages with him for 30 years and appeared at the bottom of his guest lists. That circle knew the man the obituaries did not quite describe. They knew him with the particular knowledge of people who had been chosen, in different ways and for different reasons, to see the version that the institution did not photograph. Most of them have kept their end of the arrangement. The question of what Philip was in the private parts of his life will not be resolved from the outside. The people who could resolve it chose not to, and the choosing was, in itself, the last thing they gave him. He had spent his life letting the silence do the work. His circle learned from him how that was done, and they have done it with the same discipline he would have recognized, and the same refusal to explain that he would have approved of. The biographies that began appearing after his death in April 2021 assembled the record from the evidence that decades of social journalism and court documentation and memoir writing had produced, and the record they assembled was more honest than the version available during his lifetime. Ingrid Seward's Prince Philip Revealed, published in 2020, had provided the most comprehensive recent account. Giles Brandreth's Philip and Elizabeth, published in 2004, had drawn on direct access to Philip that few biographers had been given. Hugo Vickers had assembled material from close associates and household staff willing to talk. The aggregate of these accounts is a portrait more complete than the official version allowed itself to be, and more specific than the silence the circle maintained would have preferred. What the portrait shows is a man whose emotional life was organized by the same imperatives that organized his professional life: a preference for competence over performance, a discomfort with dependency, the specific quality of attention he extended to people whose abilities he respected, and the sustained commitment to the commitments he had made, rather than the commitments that were institutionally convenient. The Thursday Club was a commitment he maintained for 15 years. The connection to Elén Cordet was a commitment he maintained across 5 decades. The Pat Kirkwood situation was a commitment he declined to make and then declined to discuss. The connection to Sacha Abercorn was a commitment sustained across 30 years. The and also at the bottom of 30 years of guest lists was the commitment most clearly visible in its duration and most inadequately explained by the institutional language applied to it. These are not the commitments of a man who treated his private relationships as casual or temporary. They are the commitments of a man who attached, when he attached, with the same tenacity the people who knew him best described as his most characteristic quality in every dimension of his life. He did not walk away from things that were not working in the way that people who prioritize their own comfort walk away from things. He walked away from things only when the alternative was a public confrontation that would damage the institutional structure the monarchy required. Pat Kirkwood's 59 years of waiting was the price of his judgment that the alternative to silence was worse than the silence itself. Philip's approach to his own legacy was consistent with his approach to everything else. He did not write the memoir. He did not give extended authorized interviews. He gave biographers occasional access and occasional comments that were interesting enough to indicate what he could have said if he had wanted to, and specific enough to be useful without being comprehensive. He shaped the record by what he included and by what he left out, with the skill of someone who had understood since the 1950s that the record would eventually be assembled from whatever he allowed to exist. What he allowed to exist was enough. The school fees and the godparent commitments, and the sustained visits, and the guest lists with their consistent additions were there for the biographers to find. He had not hidden them. He had not announced them either. He had placed them in the record in the way that a person places things in a room they expect to be eventually examined, arranged rather than concealed, available to the person willing to look carefully, invisible to the person who expects the important things to be labeled. The question of faithfulness that runs beneath the whole account has been answered by the people best positioned to answer it, and their answers are what they are. Parker said 100% faithful. Charteris said there was no evidence of any kind that he had strayed. Hicks said the Queen understood the friendships and recognized them for exactly what they were. These are credible accounts from people with the access required to know. The friendships themselves, described by the women who held them, present something more complicated than any of those testimonies fully addresses. Ellén's silence is not evidence of an affair. It is evidence of something she considered worth protecting through silence, and the protection lasted 5 decades. Kirkwood's 59 years of waiting is not evidence of an affair. It is evidence that the evening of October 1948 had consequences for her that it did not have for Philip, and that the asymmetry of those consequences was something she spent her life trying to have addressed, and that he spent his life declining to address. Sacha's careful statement is not a confession. It is a careful statement by someone who knew exactly what it was doing and why it needed to be done. Penny's presence at the funeral, with the aide's description of heartbreak, is not evidence of an affair. It is evidence that the friendship was close enough that Philip's death was experienced by Penny as the loss the aide described. None of these pieces of evidence assembled together produce a verdict. They produce a portrait of a man whose private life was more extensive and more sustained and more specifically human than the official version of his position allowed, and whose circle understood this and chose to be part of it rather than to be outside it. The choosing was the significant thing. None of the people in Philip's circle were required to maintain their end of the arrangement by anything except their own decision. Elén could have answered the question her memoir raised. Kirkwood could have been more aggressive in pursuing the public statement she wanted. Sacha could have said more than the carefully parsed statement she provided to the Telegraph. Penny could have spoken directly to the press about the character of the 30-year friendship, rather than allowing palace statements to do the characterizing for her. They maintained the arrangement because it was theirs as much as his. He had offered them something specific: his company, his attention, the specific form of regard that his intelligence and his particular kind of presence generated in the people he chose to extend it toward. In return, they offered what the arrangement required: the discretion that protected the version of his life the official version could not accommodate. The exchange was voluntary on both sides, and the voluntary character of it is part of what makes the arrangement morally different from a powerful man requiring silence from people who had no choice. They had choices, they made them, and they kept making them, consistently, across decades, with the discipline that Philip himself maintained, and that he would have recognized as the thing most worth respecting about all of them. The specific shape of what Philip left behind in the private dimension of his life is not a mystery. It is a set of documented relationships, each of which lasted decades, each of which was maintained with a consistency that makes the word sustained inadequate, because sustained implies effort, and Philip's approach to these connections does not read like effort. It reads like preference, like the natural expression of what he valued, like the practical application of a man's genuine inclinations in the spaces available to them. He valued women who had built themselves, not women who had arrived at their position through inheritance or institutional association. He valued people who could follow an argument wherever it went, without requiring the argument to arrive somewhere comfortable. He valued company that did not need him to perform, which in his life was an extraordinary and rare thing, because the performance was the constant in virtually every other context he occupied. He valued loyalty, not the loyalty of institutional obligation, but the loyalty of personal choice. The kind that does not come with a salary, and cannot be dismissed because it was never employed. What he built from those preferences was the circle, and the circle held its shape for decades because the people in it understood what they had agreed to and chose to honor the agreement. The agreement was never stated. It did not need to be. It was arrived at through the natural process by which people who understand each other reach an understanding, by inhabiting the same territory long enough to develop a shared sense of what the territory requires. The territory required discretion. It required the capacity to hold a connection that the official world could not acknowledge in its fullest form, and to hold it without letting the incompleteness of the acknowledgement become destructive. It required the specific kind of maturity that comes from having decided, consciously and with a full understanding of the costs, that a thing is worth having at the price it comes with. Elén had decided this. Pat Kirkwood had decided that the thing was worth having, but had spent 59 years renegotiating the price, which was her prerogative and entirely understandable. Sacha had decided it, and said so in the only terms available to her publicly. Penny had decided it, and expressed that decision across 3 decades of the most consistent and visible connection Philip maintained in the final third of his life. The account of Philip's circle is, at its base, an account of what it costs to be close to a person whose life is as publicly constrained as Philip's was. The constraints were real. They were institutional rather than personal, imposed by the position rather than chosen by the man. But the costs of those constraints were distributed outward, to the people who chose to be close to him, rather than being contained within the institutional boundaries that the position was designed to manage. That distribution was not entirely fair. Pat Kirkwood's 59 years of waiting makes that clear. That it was not designed to be unfair, that Philip did not set out to impose those costs, is also probably true. He was a man who lived inside the constraints that his position imposed, and who dealt with those constraints by building the private world that the public world could not provide. The private world had costs. The people who built it with him carried those costs. Most of them decided the building was worth it. He was charming, restless, and privately arranged in ways that his circle watched, and his palace managed, and his wife navigated across a marriage that lasted longer than most institutions, and contained more than most accounts have been willing to say. The final years of his active social life, from roughly 2010 until the hospitalizations of his last 18 months, were years in which most of the circle he had built across the previous 60 had either died or become too old and distant from the active social world to maintain the kind of sustained presence they had once maintained. Elén was gone, dead in 1996. Daphne du Maurier was gone, dead in 1989. Pat Kirkwood was gone, dead in 2007. Sasha was gone, dead in 2018. Mike Parker was gone, dead in 2001. The people who had populated the Thursday Club world of the late 1940s and early 1950s were long gone. Penny was there. She was the last major surviving member of the private circle, the last person with whom Philip maintained the kind of sustained, calendar-consistent, personally chosen connection that the circle had always been organized around. She was 46 years younger than Philip. She had outlasted everyone else who had occupied the private side of his social world. She had been with him through the death of Mountbatten, through the death of her daughter, through the tabloid attention of the 90s, through Norton's departure from the marriage, through Philip's own progressive withdrawal from public events in his mid-90s. She had been and also for 30 years. The retirement Philip formally announced in August 2017, withdrawing from all public engagements at the age of 96, did not end the private social calendar. He continued to receive people at Windsor. He continued to arrange the occasions that the household staff managed and that the guest lists reflected. He continued to be himself in the way that people continue to be themselves when the public performance has been officially set down, with the particular relief that retirement from performance brings. Penny continued to appear at the private occasions with the consistency that the "and also" designation had always described. He died on the 9th of April 2021. He had been at Windsor for 14 months, through the pandemic, with Elizabeth, in the reduced circumstances that two very old people in a large house with a reduced staff inhabit when the world outside has been temporarily suspended. The circumstances were not distressing to him in the way they might have been to someone less practiced at finding the version of himself that worked within whatever constraints the situation imposed. He had been practicing that particular skill since December 1922. Penny was at the funeral. She looked heartbroken. The aide who described her used the phrase, "best friend." The palace has not added anything to that. The silence is appropriate. It is the sound of an arrangement being honored, of people keeping the end of a commitment they made voluntarily and have maintained consistently, and of an institution doing what institutions do when the people who built the thing have kept their agreement, and the institution has no incentive to be more transparent than the people it is protecting. Philip's life was long. It was public in ways that exhausted the people around him, and private in ways that the public account does not fully capture. He built the private version of it with the same deliberate care that he brought to the public one, selecting the people, maintaining the connections, honoring his end of the arrangements he made, and leaving enough on the record that the biographers who came after could assemble something closer to the full picture than the official version provided. The full picture is not available. It may never be. The people who hold the pieces of it have held them for so long that the holding has become the point, the final expression of the thing they agreed to do for him, and that they are continuing to do. He was charming, restless, and privately arranged in ways that his circle watched, and his palace managed, and his wife navigated across a marriage that lasted longer than most institutions, and contained more than most accounts have been willing to say. The circle kept watching. They are keeping it still. The historical record that exists of Philip's private life is, in the end, the record that the circle allowed to exist. It is the record of the school fees and the godparent commitments and the guest lists. The record of one evening in October 1948 and 59 years of its aftermath. The record of wheelers on Thursday afternoons and the social journalism of the late 1940s and the 1950s that described what was happening there in terms careful enough to be published. The record of the photographs at horse shows and carriage driving competitions, and the consistent presence documented across 30 years of annual events. The record of Sasha's statement and Elén's blank, and Kirkwood's memoir, and Penny's presence at the funeral. That record is enough. It is enough for biographers to assemble a portrait that is more honest than the official version allowed itself to be. It is enough for the people who read the biographies or watch documentaries about Philip's life to understand that the official version was always the starting point, rather than the whole account. It is not enough to resolve the question of faithfulness that lies at its center, and it will probably never be enough to resolve that question, because the people who hold the answer chose to hold it. The choice was made repeatedly by multiple people across multiple decades, with the full understanding of what they were choosing and what the choice cost. That is not the portrait of a man who was dishonest, in the simple sense of lying to people who trusted him. It is the portrait of a man who was complicated in the way that all people are complicated, who arranged his life to accommodate the complications as well as his position allowed, and whose circle chose to be part of the arrangement rather than to expose it. Historians will continue to disagree about what the arrangement contained. The disagreement is the honest response to evidence that is extensive enough to establish that something was there and incomplete enough to prevent the something from being precisely named. Philip arranged it that way. He understood, from decades of managing the territory between what people wanted to know and what he was willing to say, that the arrangement's value depended on the something remaining unnamed. His circle understood it too. They were, each of them in their own way, people who had thought carefully about the relationship between what is kept and what is released, and who had decided, for their own reasons and through their own judgment, that keeping was the right thing to do. The right thing to do, in this account, is what they did. The record they allowed to exist is enough. If this video has been worth your time, please subscribe before you leave and hit the notification bell so you receive every new video we publish. This channel is supported entirely by the people who watch it, and the research that goes into accounts like this one takes weeks of careful work across primary sources and published biographies and documentary records. Share this video with someone you think would find this history as valuable as you have. Leave us a comment below telling us which part of this story surprised you most, or which of the people in Philip's circle you would want to know more about. We read every comment, and your engagement with this channel is what allows us to keep making it. Thank you.